For 5 years, she breathed the same air as the most powerful alpha on the continent, and he never once knew her name. She scrubbed his floors, carried his firewood, disappeared into the shadows between torchlight and stone, and every single day the bond between them pulled tighter than a noose around her throat. Because she was his fated mate, and she could never let him find out. She wasn't hiding from fear alone. She was hiding because the moment he discovered the truth, one of them would have to die. Stay with me until the end of this story. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my people are watching from. And if this one gets under your skin the way I think it will, hit like and subscribe. Because this is the kind of story they don't write anymore. The obsidian walls of Valor's Draxen fortress did not welcome people. They absorbed them. Travelers who arrived at the fortress gates for the first time often described the same sensation, that the black stone wasn't simply built from the earth, but carved directly from the bones of something that had once been alive and enormous, and very, very old. The towers rose without elegance or ornament. No banners decorated the parapets, no gilded flourishes softened the angles. The fortress existed as an argument made in stone, that power did not require beauty, only mass, only permanence, only the willingness to endure. Inside those walls 5 years ago, a woman named Elyria had learned to become invisible. Not metaphorically. Not in the poetic sense that minor souls sometimes use when describing their social irrelevance. She had learned the specific, grinding, methodical craft of human erasure, the art of moving through a room so quietly that the eye slid past her the way water slides past stone. She had studied which floorboards in the eastern corridor creaked under weight. She had memorized the patrol rotations of every guard shift. She knew that the head housekeeper, Madame Corvith, took her evening tea at the second bell and was functionally deaf in her left ear for 20 minutes afterward. She knew that the servant's entrance to the king's private study had a latch that needed lifting before pulling, not pulling alone, or it shrieked like a wounded animal. She knew these things because her life depended on knowing them, not the life of a servant afraid of a scolding, the life of a woman for whom discovery meant the end of everything. On this particular evening, the 7th day of early spring, the frost still hard on the ground, the sky a bruised purple over the mountains, Elyria was on her knees in the third-floor corridor outside the East Council chamber, scrubbing the stone floor with a brush made of river reeds and coarse soap that smelled of lye and pine tar. Her hands were raw from the work and from the cold water she'd used through the afternoon. The skin across her knuckles had cracked in 2 places. She hadn't bothered to wrap them. Wrapping them would have required going to the servant's medicine cabinet, which required speaking to the under-housekeeper, which required being noticed. She had not been noticed in 5 years. She intended to keep it that way. The corridor outside the council chamber was always the last section assigned to the night cleaning crew because it ran directly adjacent to the king's private war room, where meetings frequently extended past the dinner bell, past the evening prayer hour, past the point where most of the court had retired and the fortress settled into its nightly silence. Tonight was no different. Voices drifted through the heavy oak door to her right, low, deliberate. The specific cadence of men who were not arguing but were building toward it. She kept her head down. Brush, rinse, brush, rinse. She was, as far as anyone who glanced down this hall would see, simply part of the architecture. Then the door opened. Elyria did not look up. She heard the footsteps of 2 men emerging from the war room, heard the brief scrape of the door hinges, heard the weighted silence that followed the closing of the door. She kept the brush moving. She was 5 feet from the doorway, close enough that she could have reached out and touched the boots of whoever had stopped just outside the threshold. But she was facing away, her back to the chamber entrance, and the darkness in the corridor was deep enough that a kneeling woman in a gray servant's dress was nothing more than a shape on the floor, a piece of the work, a thing without a face. The council is stalling again. The voice belonged to Commander Aldrich Fenbrook. She recognized it instantly, the particular burr in his consonants, the controlled exhaustion that had been building in his tone for months. He was Vialor's oldest general and the man who had served as de facto war master since before the current king's coronation. His voice was the sound of a man who had spent 30 years making hard decisions on behalf of other men's ambitions. "They've been stalling since autumn." The second voice stopped Elyria's brush mid-stroke. She forced it to continue. "Stalling is what men do when they lack the courage to either comply or resist. They occupy the middle ground and call it strategy. Valor Draxen, the Alpha King. She had heard his voice from a distance more times than she could count across 5 years. She had heard it in the Great Hall during assembly, heard it filtering through closed doors during tribunal sessions, heard it once in the dead of winter 2 years ago, echoing up from the interior courtyard at midnight when he had reportedly stood in the snow for 2 hours discussing something with his first wolf, a conversation that none of the court had been privy to and that the servants had whispered about for weeks afterward. But she had never heard his voice this close, 5 feet less. The heat of his presence reached her before the scent did, and that was the part she'd never been able to fully explain even to herself. That the Alpha King radiated something that wasn't temperature exactly, but was the feeling of temperature, a density in the air immediately around him that the body registered as warmth, even when the stone corridor was cold enough to see her breath. Her wolf, the part of her she kept locked in silence, bound in will and denial and years of practice, pushed upward against the restraint with sudden and violent interest. She pressed it back down. Breathe, work, do not look up. Do not breathe too deeply. You are nothing. You are the floor. They'll vote against the Northern Tariff proposal, Aldrich said. Harwick's bloc has 3 votes locked already. If Councillor Dren flips, it becomes 4. Dren won't flip. There was the sound of Valor moving. Not a full step, but a shift of weight, the creak of boot leather. He was leaning against the corridor wall. She could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Dren is a coward, not an idealist. Harwick is offering him something. Find out what it is before the morning session. And if I can't, then make Harwick an offer he considers more valuable. The specifics are your discretion. I trust your judgment on the price. A pause. Aldrich said carefully, That's a broader mandate than you've given me before. The council has been broader in its contempt than they've been before. Match the energy, Aldrich. The general made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh, or might have been the exhale of a man who had just been handed a task with significant moral weight and was deciding how to carry it. His footsteps moved away down the corridor, east toward the officers' quarters. Valor did not move. The brush in Elyria's hand had stopped. She made it move again, each stroke slow and deliberate, the specific rhythm of a woman who was not thinking about anything except the stone beneath her hands. She was very good at this. She had practiced. But the king was still standing there. She heard the exact moment he became aware of her, not because he made a sound, but because the quality of the silence changed. The way silence changes when it becomes inhabited by attention. What's your name? Elyria kept scrubbing. Myla, my lord. Myla. He repeated it the way a man tests a word he suspects is counterfeit. How long have you been cleaning this corridor tonight? Since the 3rd bell, my lord. Then you heard everything my general and I discussed. Her brush found a particularly stubborn patch near the base of the wall. She worked at it carefully. I heard nothing useful, my lord. Only that the council meets tomorrow. I expect that's no secret. A longer silence. Look up. She did. And that was, in the architecture of 5 years of survival, the single most dangerous mistake she had ever made. Not because it gave her away, because it didn't. Because she had prepared her face for this possibility, the way a soldier prepares armor for an expected attack. Her expression was smooth and neutral, and entirely ordinary. Her eyes were lowered enough to pass for deference, without being lowered so far as to suggest she had something to hide. But the mistake was that she saw his face. She had spent 5 years carefully, methodically, deliberately not looking directly at Valor Draxen, because she had known, with the specific animal certainty of someone who understands their own vulnerability, that looking at him directly would create a problem she could not manage. She had been right. She could feel the confirmation of it moving through her chest like a crack running through ice. The recognition that lived in the blood, in the marrow, in whatever ancient mechanism governed the bond between paired wolves. His gray eyes were not the cold stone color she'd expected from the stories told about him. They were the gray of deep water, the gray of sky before a storm that has not decided yet whether it will be rain or lightning. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he cannot identify, but cannot dismiss. You're not one of Corvith's regular crew, he said. I cover shifts for the North Wing, my lord, when they're short-staffed. "You're covering a shift on the floor directly outside my private war room." "It's a floor, my lord. It needed cleaning." Something moved across his expression. Not suspicion exactly, but the precursor to it. The slight tightening of attention that preceded the question he was about to ask. She held his gaze for exactly the length of time a servant who had nothing to hide would hold it, 2 full seconds, direct and calm, and then returned her eyes to the floor and resumed scrubbing. She heard him breathe. She heard him stay. And then she heard him, finally, push off the wall and walk away down the corridor in the opposite direction from Aldrich, south toward the private wing. She listened to his footsteps until they were gone. She listened to the silence until it was just the silence again. Then she sat back on her heels and let herself shake for precisely 1 minute. She did not allow herself more than that. The servants' dormitory occupied the lowest accessible level of the fortress's west wing, a long, low-ceilinged room with 16 narrow beds arranged in 2 rows, a single hearth at the far end that was kept burning from autumn through late spring, and walls that sweated moisture in the cold months and developed a peculiar greenish tinge in summer that the head housekeeper maintained was architectural and not biological, though the servants disagreed privately. It was not a comfortable room. It was a functional one, which was, as Elyria had come to understand over 5 years, the only category of thing that truly existed in Veilor Draxen's household. She arrived back at the dormitory just after the 4th bell, later than the other women, who were mostly asleep in various states of exhaustion. She moved to her bed at the far end, corner position, back against 2 walls, closest to the secondary exit that led to the storeroom corridor, and sat on the edge of it with her cracked hands resting on her knees and her mind running the incident in the 3rd-floor corridor through every possible angle of analysis. He had looked at her, not the way men sometimes looked at female servants, with the particular entitled carelessness that registered them as objects in the room rather than persons in it. He had looked at her the way the Alpha King looked at things he was trying to understand. She had prepared for many contingencies over 5 years. She had prepared for accidental recognition by someone who had known her from her former life, had, in fact, spent the first year in the fortress in near constant terror of exactly that possibility, before concluding that enough time had passed, enough weight had dropped from her frame, enough of her courtly polish had been scraped away by the work, that the woman scrubbing floors bore no resemblance to the girl who had once worn an Empress's circlet. She had prepared for the physical reality of the bond, had developed, through years of iron-willed practice, a system of controlled breathing and deliberate mental redirection that could suppress her wolf's instinct in almost every circumstance. She had even prepared, in the abstract way one prepares for catastrophic possibilities, for the moment when Veilor might stand close enough that suppression would become genuinely difficult. She had not, in 5 years of preparation, found a satisfactory solution to that last problem. Because the bond didn't care about her survival strategy. The bond was older than survival strategies. It was older than empires, older than the specific brand of political catastrophe that had taken her throne and her mother and her name, and replaced them all with borrowed identities and cracked knuckles, and a bed in the corner of a dormitory that smelled of damp stone and wood smoke. The bond simply recognized what it recognized. And Veilor Draxen's wolf had been circling the edge of that recognition for 5 years without knowing what it was circling. Elyria lay down on her bed without removing her dress and stared at the low stone ceiling and thought about the spring sovereign ball. It was coming, 12 days. The one event in the fortress's annual calendar that she had never been able to successfully avoid, not because she was required to attend it, because servants were emphatically not required to attend the court's grand social occasions, but because the pre-event preparation consumed the entire household staff for 3 days minimum, and the post-event cleanup required all hands, and during the event itself, supplementary serving staff was pulled from the dormitory crews to carry wine and food and torches through the Great Hall. She had managed, over the previous 4 years, to arrange her assignments so that she worked the kitchen staging area during the ball itself, close enough to the event to fulfill her obligations, far enough from the hall floor that she was never in direct proximity to the court's assembled guests. This year, Madame Corvith had assigned her to the hall floor. She had tried to renegotiate. The head housekeeper had looked at her with the specific expression of a woman who had been managing servants for 30 years and had no interest in their preferences. You've avoided the hall assignment every year since you came to us, Mila. It's your turn. Stop fussing. 12 days. The Spring Sovereign Ball. The single event where every noble family with a title and an ambition assembled inside these walls. Where faces from the courts of 6 kingdoms shared space with the Alpha King's inner circle. Where the possibility of recognition, real recognition, not the vague instinctive unease of a wolf who couldn't name what he was sensing, became genuine. She needed to find a way out of the assignment, or she needed to find a way out of the fortress entirely. She already knew, with the cold clarity of a woman who had spent 5 years making decisions in extremis, which of those two options was more realistic. She was not leaving. She had not survived 5 years inside the obsidian walls of her greatest enemy's household just to run when the threat came close. She had not endured the cracked hands and the gray dress, and the performance of invisibility through 4 brutal winters to abandon the only position of proximity that gave her any chance at understanding Malgrath's movements, his alliances, his plans. Malgrath Voss, the man who had poisoned her mother and taken her throne, maintained diplomatic contact with Violor Draxon's court. He sent envoys. He sent letters. He sent the occasional minor functionary bearing gifts and goodwill that neither party actually believed in. And through 5 years inside the fortress, Elyria had intercepted enough of those communications, carefully, partially, always in fragments, to understand that the relationship between the Dark Sorcerer's empire and the Alpha King was not simply the cold political neutrality it appeared to be on the surface. Something was being negotiated. She didn't know what yet. She wasn't leaving until she did. The Spring Sovereign Ball began at sundown and was scheduled to extend until midnight, though in practice it always ran longer because the nobility of 6 kingdoms drank heavily and had poor relationships with time. The Great Hall of Draxon Fortress had been transformed across 3 days of preparation into something that was, despite the obsidian bones of the place, genuinely spectacular. Banners of deep indigo and silver hung between the columns, the central floor cleared and polished to a reflective mirror shine, 600 candles burning in iron chandeliers overhead, the air thick with the smell of beeswax and expensive wine, and the particular collective warmth generated by 300 bodies in formal dress. Elyria had spent the first 2 hours of the event in the furthest reach of her assigned zone, at the northwest corner of the hall, carrying a tray of wine glasses she refilled far more frequently than they required from the nearest staging station. She had managed to position herself consistently near the peripheral columns, visible enough to be accounted for by any supervisor who swept the room, invisible enough within the general movement of the evening that no individual guest would find cause to focus on her specifically. She was wearing, as required, the uniform of a floor-serving staff, a plain dark dress with a white apron, her hair pinned severely, her face scrubbed clean of anything that might be construed as ornament. She looked, as she had spent 5 years learning to look, like someone who belonged to the background of every room she entered. The evening was going, by all functional measures, well. And then she heard the voice. "Well, I'll be damned." The man was standing 6 feet to her left, near a column, and he was holding a wine glass and staring at her with the expression of a man who has just seen something he absolutely did not expect to see. He was perhaps 45 years old, broad across the shoulders, wearing the formal livery of an Eastern merchant house that she recognized but couldn't immediately place. His face, though. His face she knew, from her former life, from the court of her childhood. His name was Breton Salve. He had been a minor trade attaché to her mother's court. He had attended 6 consecutive harvest festivals at the Imperial Palace. He had once, when she was perhaps 15 and newly beginning to understand that men looked at her differently than they looked at other girls, made a comment in a corridor that her mother had needed to address through a formal intermediary. She had not thought about Breton Salve in 5 years. She had not imagined him being here. He took a step toward her. She turned away, smoothly, and walked at the exact unhurried pace of a servant completing a circuit of the hall toward the nearest staging station. Her pulse was doing something complicated. She kept her shoulders level. She kept her hands steady on the tray. She moved through the crowd the way she had moved through everything in this fortress for 5 years, like something that wasn't quite there. He followed her. Not immediately, not obviously. She tracked him in her peripheral vision as she moved, watched him set his glass on the nearest table and begin moving through the crowd on a trajectory that would intersect with hers if she continued toward the staging station. She adjusted her route. He adjusted his. He was not subtle about it, but he didn't need to be. Because to any outside observer, he was simply a guest moving through a crowd, and she was simply a servant moving through a crowd. And neither of those movements looked like pursuit. She changed direction again, moving toward the center of the hall this time, deeper into the crowd where the density of bodies would complicate his ability to track her. She needed 5 minutes. Long enough to get to the East Service corridor, down to the staging area, out the back passage, and up to the domestic quarters by the servant's stair. She could make herself absent for the remainder of the evening. She could be a woman who had gone home ill. She could be invisible in a room by being simply not in the room. She made it to within 10 feet of the East Service corridor door. There she is. Breton Salve said it loudly enough that the small cluster of nobles nearest to him turned to look. He said it with the specific cheerful brutality of a man who has had 3 glasses of good wine and has decided that this particular social situation is entertaining. I knew I recognized you. I haven't seen you since, the Imperial Autumn Festival? That's got to be 6 years ago now. The nobles who had turned to look were still looking. I think you've mistaken me for someone else, my lord. Her voice came out clean and flat and utterly uninterested. Mistake you? He laughed. It was not a kind laugh. I never forget a face, especially not one that... He paused, and something shifted in his expression, the wine-fueled cheerfulness giving way to something more calculated as he looked at her uniform, her pinned hair, the tray in her hands. Especially not one that I last saw wearing a tiara. The silence that followed was local. Only the 6 or 8 people nearest to them had heard, but it was the kind of silence that spread. In a room full of political animals, unusual silences were interesting. Interesting silences drew attention. Attention drew more attention. Elyria looked at him. She did not, in that moment, have a plan. She had, in 5 years, never failed to have a plan, never found herself in a position where the next move was genuinely unclear to her. She was in that position now. She could deny it. She could laugh it off as the confusion of a drunk man. She could make a scene, create enough noise and disruption that the social discomfort of the moment overrode its informational content in the minds of the witnesses. She could set down the tray and walk away and trust that the crowd and the darkness at the hall's edges would absorb her before the situation cohered into something actionable. She was still calculating when the second voice arrived, Breton Salve. It came from behind her and slightly to the left. A woman's voice, warm as a blade that has been left in the sun to heat up before being used. Don't you have a trading contract negotiation to attend to in the morning? I'd think a man with your debts would want to spend his evenings cultivating allies rather than harassing the help. Lady Seraphine Valacrest. Elyria knew the name the way she knew all names in the fortress, through 5 years of silent collection. Seraphine Valacrest was the eldest daughter of the Valacrest family, whose lands abutted the fortress's western holdings. She was 28 years old, politically ambitious, and had been conducting a sustained and largely one-sided campaign for the Alpha King's romantic attention for 3 seasons. She was also, by every observable measure, profoundly intelligent in the specific way that dangerous people are intelligent, not creative, not visionary, but precise, methodical, the kind of intelligence that was better at dismantling other people's structures than building its own. Breton Salve blinked. Some calculation was happening behind his eyes. Seraphine was smiling at him with the expression of a woman who holds information and is deciding how to price it. Lady Valacrest, he said finally, a lovely evening. It is. Go enjoy it somewhere else. He went. Elyria stood with her tray and waited. Seraphine did not look at her immediately. She surveyed the crowd around them with the patience of someone who is in no hurry because the situation is entirely under her control. When the cluster of nearby nobles had drifted back into their own conversations, she turned. Her eyes were a very clear, pale green, the kind of eyes that did not miss things. "Mila, isn't it?" she said. Not a question. "Yes, my lady." "You've worked in this household for 5 years." "Yes, my lady." "And in 5 years you've never attended a social event in the hall. Tonight is your first time on the floor." She glanced at the tray. You've been carrying the same 12 glasses of wine for 2 hours. You've refilled them 6 times without delivering a single one." Elyria said nothing. "What our friend Breton was about to say," Seraphine continued, her voice dropping slightly, the warmth going out of it and leaving something considerably more direct behind, "would have created a scene that you clearly did not want. I interrupted it. You should probably understand why." "Why, my lady?" Seraphine looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind those pale green eyes. Not warmth, not compassion, but the specific expression of a person who is choosing how much of their hand to show. "Because a scene would have involved the king," she said, "and I'd rather control when and how the king learns interesting things about the people in his household." She took a glass of wine from Illyria's tray without asking. "Enjoy the rest of the evening, Mila." She walked away into the crowd. Elyria stood where she was for a moment that lasted considerably longer than it should have. The analytical part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive for 5 years, was already sorting what had just happened into its component parts and assessing the damage. Breton Salve had recognized her. Seraphine Valicrest had stopped him from saying what he was about to say. Seraphine Valicrest was not acting out of kindness. Seraphine Valicrest now knew, or strongly suspected, something she had not known an hour ago. The situation had just become significantly more complicated. She needed to leave the hall. She turned toward the east corridor entrance and was 3 steps from it when the crowd shifted in the way crowds shift when something at their center has changed. A ripple of redirected attention, of bodies adjusting to accommodate a new focal point. She looked up. Vaelor Draxon had descended from the upper gallery, where he'd spent the first half of the evening conducting the formal receiving of guests, and was now on the floor of the great hall for the first time tonight. He was wearing black, as he always wore black, though this was not the black of his working clothes or his armor. It was formal, structured, the kind of tailoring that required skill and expense. He was moving through the crowd with the ease of a man who had never in his life needed to wonder whether people would make room for him. And people were making room for him, and he was exchanging brief words with various guests with the controlled courtesy of a ruler who was performing sociability rather than experiencing it. His path, as dictated by the geography of the hall and the distribution of guests who required acknowledgement, was moving in a general direction that would bring him, in approximately 4 minutes, to the northwest corner of the floor, where she was standing. Elyria turned back toward the east corridor door, and Breton Salve stepped directly into her path. He had not gone far. He had retreated to the base of the nearest column and waited, and now he was standing between her and the door with his arms loosely at his sides, and the wine glass dangling from one hand, and the expression of a man who had, in the 3 minutes since Seraphine had dismissed him, made a decision. "You know," he said quietly now, the public performance gone, "I thought about it, after Valicrest interrupted me. I thought about why a woman like you would be carrying wine glasses at a king's party when the last time I saw her she had an honor guard." He tilted his head. "And I thought about what a piece of information like that might be worth to certain parties who've been looking for you for a very long time." "You're drunk," she said, pleasantly. He took a sip of his wine. "Malgrath Voss has an open bounty, has had one for 6 years. It's a remarkable amount of gold. Enough to settle a man's debts. Enough to establish a new trading position, enough to buy a title if he's in the right market." The hall was loud around them, music, conversation, the specific roar of 300 people who were warm and fed and slightly drunk. She was aware of Vaelor, 40 feet away, still moving through the crowd. She was aware of the door behind Breton Salve, and the distance, and the time, and the specific geometry of how quickly a situation could move from complicated to catastrophic. "Step aside," she said. "Not until we've had a conversation about—" She did not plan what happened next. That was the truth of it, though she would later analyze it with the same cold precision she applied to everything. She did not plan it, but her body had spent 6 years, the one before the fortress, the 5 inside it, making decisions faster than her conscious mind could direct. And the decision her body made was to take the tray in her right hand, which was a heavy silver service tray, and place it firmly and deliberately against Breton Salve's wine glass, which caused the wine to leave the glass at velocity and arrive on the front of his formal jacket. He made a sound. He stepped back. He reached for something that wasn't there, the reflexive grasp of a man who wants to set down what he's holding and has nowhere to set it. She was past him before he completed the motion. She was through the east corridor door 8 steps later. Autek. The corridor was dark and cool and smelled of stone and the faint remnant of dinner from the kitchens below. She moved fast, not running, because running in a servant's corridor created sound and drew attention, but at the specific urgent walk of someone who has an immediate task elsewhere. Her mind was running the numbers. How long before Breton recovered and followed? Whether he'd come after her directly or send a message first. Whether Seraphine had seen the incident from wherever she'd positioned herself in the crowd. Whether anyone in the immediate vicinity of the confrontation had been paying close enough attention to register it as significant rather than as the mundane small collision of 2 people in a wine glass at a crowded party. She made it to the stairwell door. She was reaching for the handle. That was smoothly done. She stopped. The voice came from a recessed alcove to her left. A storage niche, deep enough to shadow its contents, the kind of architectural feature that existed in the older wings of the fortress as a remnant of a previous century's building habits. She had catalogued it. She had catalogued every alcove, every recess, every shadow point in every corridor she regularly moved through, because shadows were how she lived. Someone else had known about this one. Valor Draxon stepped out of the alcove. He was not 40 feet away anymore. He was 4 feet away. He had not, it became immediately clear, taken the trajectory through the crowd that she'd been tracking. He had already been in the corridor. He had come this way before she had. "You left the hall," she said. Her voice came out flat, professional. "I often leave the hall during the ball." His eyes were doing the thing they'd done in the corridor outside the war room. That quality of attention that was not quite suspicion and not quite recognition, but was the exact combination of both. "I find them tedious. Too many people who want something from me pretending they don't." He looked at the east corridor door behind her, then back at her face. "Was that man bothering you?" "He was confused, my lord. He mistook me for someone else." "He mentioned Malgrath Voss." The silence lasted exactly as long as it needed to, which was not long at all. She had known the moment she heard his voice that the calculation had changed again, and she had been spending the seconds of this conversation running the new numbers, and the new numbers were telling her something she needed to decide whether to believe or not. "I didn't hear that part clearly," she said. "I expect you did." He was still looking at her with that quality of attention that she could not suppress her wolf's response to. Not entirely. Not at this distance. "Mila?" The name sat there between them. "My lord." "That's not your name." Her next breath came slow and measured. "I've worked in your household for 5 years, my lord. I think you'd know by now if that weren't my name." "I'd know," he said, "if anyone had been paying attention, which it seems no one has been." He took a step closer. The warmth of him reached her, that dense, concentrated heat of an alpha at full attention, and her wolf surged against its restraint with a force she hadn't had to manage since the war room corridor. She kept her face still. She kept her hands at her sides. She held the line by pure practiced force of will. Someone was, though. Someone has been paying attention the whole time. "My lord, with respect, I have duties to return to." "Who are you?" The question was quiet, directness stripped of performance. Not the king asking for information, not the institutional authority demanding account of someone in his service. Just a man who had spent years aware of something he couldn't name at the edges of his senses, and who was now, for the first time, standing close enough to the source of that awareness to understand that it was real. She looked at him, and for a moment, one single, ruinous, completely unbidden moment, she almost told him. The impulse moved through her like a fault line giving way. She had been carrying it for 5 years. The weight of her real name. The weight of the thing she'd had to bury and build over and pretend wasn't there. The weight of the bond between them, which she had suppressed and denied and managed with ruthless daily discipline, and which had been waiting with extraordinary patience for exactly this kind of proximity to assert itself with full force. She caught it. She caught it the way she had always caught it, with the specific, practiced, deeply exhausted mechanism of a woman who had survived too much to surrender to even the things that felt like salvation. "Mila," she said, "that's my name. I've had a very long evening and I have cleanup duties that start in 20 minutes. Forgive me, my lord." She opened the stairwell door. She went through it. She did not look back. What she could not have known, as she descended the servants' staircase with her cracked hands braced against the cold stone wall and her wolf howling in the silence she'd forced it into, was that Valor Draxon stood in the corridor outside the stairwell door for a very long time. She could not have known that he didn't return to the ball, that he went instead to his private study and sat behind his desk in the dark for an hour, that he sent, at the 5th bell of morning, a message to his head of household intelligence requesting a full review of the dormitory staff records from the past 6 years, specifically any woman hired without prior household references, specifically any woman whose origin documents were thin or unverifiable. She could not have known that in a room on the second guest floor of the fortress, Lady Seraphine Valacrest was sitting at a writing desk, and that the letter she was composing was not addressed to anyone within the fortress walls. She could not have known what Breton Salve was doing with his wine-stained jacket and his calculation about gold and debts and what certain parties had been paying for 6 years. She only knew, lying in her corner bed in the dark dormitory while the other women slept, that 5 years of invisible survival had just reached its limit. Tomorrow she would find a new plan. Tomorrow she would assess the damage and build new walls and find the angle that kept her hidden for another season. Tonight, alone in the dark with her wolf still straining against restraint and the echo of his voice running through her without permission, "Who are you? Who are you? Who are you?" She allowed herself the one thing she never allowed herself. She was afraid. Not the productive fear that sharpened the mind and drove the body. Not the useful fear she had long since learned to metabolize into action. This was the other kind. The deep, cold, hollow fear of a woman who had built an entire life on the premise that she could control the circumstances of her own survival, and who had just, in the space of one evening, watched 3 separate people look at her and see through the architecture of what she'd built. The fear that the ghost was becoming visible. The fear that the woman she'd buried was pushing through the stone. The fear that she was running out of fortress to hide in. She did not sleep for a long time. And when she did, she dreamed of her mother's voice reading her the law of their bloodline, the first and oldest law, the one that preceded crowns and bonds and empires and everything that had been built on top of them. A queen does not kneel for survival, her mother had said. A queen survives in order to stand. She woke before dawn to the sound of boots in the corridor outside the dormitory, not the slow rhythm of the night patrol. Fast boots, urgent boots, the boots of men with a purpose. She was off her bed and at the secondary exit in 4 seconds, through the storeroom corridor in 8. She could hear now the specific sound of the dormitory door being tried, locked from inside, which gave her perhaps 30 seconds before it was opened by force or by key. She ran, not the controlled urgent walk of a woman with a task elsewhere. She ran, through the storeroom corridor, through the supply passage, through the cold back section of the fortress that connected the domestic quarters to the old east wall, toward the single exit point she had identified 3 years ago as the one place where the exterior patrol had a consistent 6-minute gap that she had never, in 3 years of careful noting, seen varied. She had never used it. She had always hoped she wouldn't need it. She was 30 feet from the exit door when she heard, behind her, the sound she had been dreading for 5 years. Not just boots now, not just men moving with purpose, but the distinctive, deep, resonant sound of a wolf given its head. Running, close. She hit the door. It didn't open. She hit it again. The mechanism was old. It required the same kind of technique as the war room latch. She'd cataloged it 3 years ago, but she'd never actually tried it, never needed to. Lift before push, or was it push before lift? The wolf sound was very close now. She lifted. She pushed. The door opened onto 6 inches of cold air and pale pre-dawn sky and the smell of frost and the mountains and a freedom she had been 5 years from reaching. And then the hand closed around her wrist. Not rough, not a grab. The specific grip of a man who is very strong and has made a decision to be careful about how he uses it, but a grip that was absolutely not releasing. She turned. Valor Draxon was standing behind her with frost on the shoulders of his coat and his gray eyes catching the first pale light of a dawn that had not yet fully arrived. Behind him, at the end of the corridor, were 2 of his guard. There was no wolf. She understood, a beat too late, that the wolf sound had been misdirection. that they'd known which exit she'd go for, which meant someone had given them the information, which meant that someone had known about the gap in the patrol, which meant, "You reviewed the household records," she said. "I reviewed them 3 hours ago." He was looking at her in the pale pre-dawn light, with an expression she could not fully read, too many things moving in it. "I've had people covering every exit of this wing since the second bell." A pause. "You would have come out here eventually." She was very aware of his hand on her wrist. "Let me go," she said. "I'll let you go the moment you tell me your name." "I told you your real name." His voice was very quiet. "The name of the woman who has been in my household for 5 years without a verifiable record. The woman who Breton Salve, who I had a conversation with at the first bell, incidentally, after he sobered up sufficiently to be coherent, connected to Malgrath Voss's open bounty." His hand on her wrist did not tighten. It simply remained. "The woman my wolf has been tracking by scent through every corridor of this fortress for years without being able to find." In the narrow passage between the obsidian wall and the open door, with the cold dawn air coming through it, Elyria looked at the Alpha King. She looked at the face she had spent 5 years carefully avoiding looking at directly. She felt the bond between them, not suppressed now, not managed, simply present in the specific devastating way that things are present when you finally stop spending energy pretending they aren't. She looked at him, and she said the name she had not said aloud in 6 years. Not the borrowed name, not the survival name, not the name she'd stitched over her real one, like a bandage over a wound that had never properly healed. Her name. The name her mother had given her in the first language of their bloodline, the one that carried the weight of the line of empresses who had come before her, the one that meant, in the oldest dialect of the continent, something between sovereign and survived. She said it, and she watched Vailor Draxon's face change, and she understood, in the terrible clarity of that moment, that the recognition in his expression was not the recognition of a king who has just identified a political problem. It was something much older than politics. It was the recognition of a wolf who has, after years of hunting through corridors of cold stone in pursuit of a scent he couldn't name, finally found what he was looking for. And across the city that was just beginning to wake outside the fortress walls, in a room she did not know about, in a bed she had never seen, Seraphine Valicrest sealed a letter with dark wax. The letter was addressed to the northern border. The letter was addressed to the empire of a man who had been searching for a runaway empress for 6 years, and the letter contained a location. The dawn came in slow and colorless through the open door, and neither of them moved. That was the first thing that would have struck any observer positioned in that narrow passage between the obsidian wall and the frost-edged morning. Not the presence of the king, not the woman in a servant's dress with her wrist in his hand, but the absolute stillness of both of them in the moment after she had spoken her name. As if the syllables had done something physical to the air between them. As if the corridor itself had registered what had just been said and was deciding how to respond. Vailor Draxon was a man who had spent his entire adult life making rapid, accurate assessments of volatile situations. He had been doing it since the age of 14, when his father had placed him in command of a border garrison as a practical education in what leadership actually required, as opposed to what it looked like from the inside of a palace. He had been assessing and deciding and acting in the space between heartbeats for 20 years. He was, by every available measure, exceptional at it. He was not assessing right now. He was standing in a pre-dawn corridor holding the wrist of a woman who had just told him she was the heir to the stolen Velthari Empire. And the only thing operating inside him with any efficiency at all was his wolf, which was not surprised by this information in the slightest, because his wolf had known in the specific inarticulate way that wolves know things, through blood and bone and the ancient circuitry of instinct, for approximately 4 years and 11 months that this woman existed somewhere inside his fortress. "Say it again," he said. "No." "Elyria." He said it himself, testing the sound of it. The full name, the imperial name. The name that the Velthari bloodline had carried for 9 generations before a sorcerer with access to poison and patience had ended that particular chapter of history. He watched her face when he said it. Something happened there, involuntary, brief, the way a muscle contracts when a nerve is touched. "Elyria Velthari." If you're planning to have me executed, she said, I'd prefer you get to it. I've had a very poor night. I'm not planning to have you executed. You have grounds. The continent believes I'm responsible for 6 years of border provocations against your northern territories. My name on a peace treaty you negotiated with Malgrath 3 years ago was forged. He said it flatly. I knew it was forged when I signed it. That stopped her. This was information that rearranged things. She could see it happening behind her eyes, the rapid recalculation, the resorting of 5 years of assumptions. He watched it with the particular attention he gave to things that mattered, the way her jaw shifted, the way her breathing changed, not accelerated but deepened, the breath of someone who has just received a piece of data that requires structural revision. You knew, she said. Malgrath's forger was competent but not exceptional. The seal was correct, but the signature pressure was wrong. Your mother's documents are archived in the old Imperial Library. We have copies. He paused. I signed it because the alternative was open war with an empire that controls 3 northern passes, and I wasn't ready for that war at that particular moment. But you've been ready since. He looked at her. You've been building toward it, she said. The calculation was moving fast now. He could see it. The mind behind the servant's face was moving with the specific speed of someone who has been managing political complexity in silence for years and is now finally allowed to think at full capacity. The northern troop rotations, the supply consolidation along the Dreven Ridge. I've been watching the household logistics records for 4 years. You've been preparing for a northern campaign. Servants, he said carefully, don't generally read household logistics records. No. She looked at him. Her eyes were steady. Whatever fear had been in her face at the moment of capture had been replaced by something considerably more formidable, the particular quality of composure that is not the absence of fear, but is something built on top of it. Composure as architecture. Composure as a weapon. They don't. He released her wrist. Not because the situation had resolved. Not because she had nowhere to go with 2 guards at the end of the corridor and an open landscape of frost and early morning beyond the door. He released it because holding it had become something other than containment, and he was aware enough of his own responses to recognize when a decision needed to be made deliberately rather than allowed to make itself. Come with me, he said. Am I being given a choice? I'm choosing to phrase it as one. She looked at the open door, the cold air, the distance between where she was standing and any kind of freedom that wasn't the theoretical kind. She turned and walked back into the corridor. He followed. The private study was on the 2nd floor of the main keep, a room that Elyria had cleaned exactly twice in 5 years, both times during the king's absence from the fortress, both times with the sick, careful attention of someone working in a space that simultaneously fascinated and terrified them. She knew where the ink was kept and which drawer of the writing desk had a stiff pull. She knew that the single window faced northeast and that the room held cold until mid-morning, regardless of the fire in the grate. She did not know it as a room she had ever inhabited as herself. She inhabited it now as herself, standing near the far wall while Valor dismissed the 2 guards with a look and closed the door and moved to the grate to build up the fire. She watched him do it, the Alpha King on his knees arranging wood and coaxing flame with the practical competence of a man who had spent enough time in the field to know that fire was a skill, not a service. Sit down, he said without looking at her. I'm fine standing. I'm not asking because you look tired. I'm asking because you're going to fall down. You've been running on fear and suppression for 5 years, and you've just used up the last of it. He sat back on his heels and looked over his shoulder at her. Sit down, Elyria. Her name in his mouth again. The full name. The real name. She had not heard it spoken by anyone in 6 years. Not since the night she'd escaped the palace with her mother's lady-in-waiting and a stolen horse, and a piece of advice she'd been living by ever since. Hearing it now was doing something to her defenses that she was not fully in control of. She sat in the chair nearest to her. He rose from the grate and moved to the desk and poured 2 cups of something from a covered pot that had been sitting at the desk's edge. Leftover from his night of records review, she assumed. He brought one to her and set it on the small table at her elbow without asking if she wanted it. The smell was dark and bitter. Not tea. Something stronger. He sat in the chair across from her. The fire was building, The room was beginning to hold some warmth. Outside the window, the sky was moving from dark to that particular gray-blue of early dawn that committed to nothing. "Tell me what happened," he said. "You first," she said. "Tell me what Breton Salve said at the first bell." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but the acknowledgement that this was a reasonable demand from a reasonable adversary. He said he recognized a woman at the ball who he believed was the lost heir of the Velthari line. He said he was going to send word to Malgrath's network in the morning. A pause. He said the bounty was enough to retire on. And I had him escorted to a guest room with a locked door and told him he'd be released once I'd confirmed his story. She absorbed this. "You're confirming his story right now. I'm getting context for it." He leaned back in his chair with his elbows on the armrests and his hands loosely clasped, and looked at her with the direct, undecorated attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things he was taking seriously. Most powerful men she had known looked at things they considered important with a kind of theatrical intensity, a performance of focus. Valor simply focused. The difference was the difference between a man holding a sword and a man who was a sword. Start at the beginning. The beginning is 6 years old and 300 miles north of here. Then start there. She looked at the cup at her elbow. She picked it up. It was very hot and very bitter, and she drank half of it before she spoke, because some things required fuel before they could be said aloud. She told him, not everything, not the interior parts, not the weight of the bond she'd been managing since her 3rd month in his fortress, not the specific architecture of what it had cost her to stand 40 feet away from him 400 times over 5 years and perform the absence of a self. Those things were hers, and she was not yet ready to decide what to do with them. But the rest of it, the night her mother died, the speed of Malgrath's move, the 2 days she'd spent hiding in the palace walls before the escape, the year she'd spent traveling southward through territories that ranged from indifferent to hostile, the decision to enter Draxon Fortress as a servant because it was the one place Malgrath's network would not think to look, and because the intelligence available from inside the Alpha King's household was, potentially, the only resource she had access to that might eventually give her a pathway back to what had been taken from her. So she told him all of that. She told it in the flat, spare language of someone recounting operational history rather than personal catastrophe, and he listened the way he focused, without interruption, without the small sounds of sympathy or surprise that people made when they were performing listening rather than doing it. When she finished, the fire was fully established and the room was warm and the sky outside the window had moved from gray-blue to a pale, non-committal white. Valor was quiet for a moment. "The intelligence you've been collecting," he said, "for 4 years. Yes. On Malgrath's communications with my court, with your diplomatic office, your trade attachés, and one of your council members." She watched his face. "You should know that Councillor Harwick has been receiving supplementary income from a Malgrath proxy for at least 3 years. The quality of his silence changed. This was, she understood, not a small piece of information. This was the kind of information that rewrote the calculus of his internal political situation retroactively. Every council session, every contested vote, every piece of legislation that had been more difficult than it should have been. She watched him run that rewrite in real time and recognized the expression of a man discovering that a problem he thought was ideological had been, at least partially, purchased. "You have documentation," he said. "Partial. Enough to establish pattern. Enough to compel a real investigation that would find the rest. And you've been holding this." "I've been holding everything," she said, "because the moment I gave you information, I had to give you a reason why I had it, and I wasn't ready to do that." He looked at her for a long time. There was something in this silence that was different from the previous ones. Less analytical, more direct. He was not, she thought, assessing the political landscape right now. He was looking at her. At the specific combination of things she was, 5 years of disciplined survival inside his household, a stolen throne, 4 years of intelligence gathering, and the name that his wolf had been tracing through corridors of cold stone without being able to attach it to a face. "What were you planning to do?" he said. "When you had enough? Go north." She set the empty cup down. "Take back what's mine. Alone. I've managed alone effectively for 6 years. You've managed survival effectively for 6 years. That's not the same thing as taking back a stolen empire from a man who controls dark sorcery, 3 mountain passes, and a palace full of loyal soldiers. He said it without cruelty, just the flat assessment of a military strategist encountering a plan that has significant logistical gaps. She said nothing, because he was not wrong, and she had known he was not wrong for most of the time she'd been here, and the gap between survival and reclamation was something she had been refusing to fully examine, because examining it meant confronting the fact that she could not do what needed to be done by herself. What I'm about to say, Valor said, leaning forward in his chair, is not an offer born out of charity. I want to be specific about that because I expect you to reject anything that smells like charity, and I don't want this to be confused for something it isn't. She waited. I've been building a case against Malgrath for 3 years. The forged treaty, the border provocations he's been conducting under your name, the trade interference in the northern corridor. I have grounds for a campaign that the other kingdoms will support, or at minimum, not oppose. What I have not had is a legitimate counterclaimant to the Velthari throne. He held her gaze. Without a living heir, any northern campaign I run looks like conquest. With one, it becomes restoration. Legally, politically, and in the view of every kingdom on this continent that has any interest in what happens to the northern territories. Elyria was very still. You want to use me, she said. I want to work with you. The distinction was precise and deliberate. There's a difference. You'd retain full claim to your throne. The political architecture of the post-campaign arrangement would require extensive negotiation, and I'll be direct about the fact that I have interests in that negotiation that are not identical to yours. But the campaign itself, removing Malgrath, restoring the legitimate Velthari governance, stabilizing the northern corridor, those interests align. She looked at him. The firelight was doing something to the planes of his face that she had been working for 5 years to avoid noticing, and she was not in a position to work at avoiding it right now. And the bond that she had managed with such exhausting discipline was present in this room with the complete lack of restraint of something that had been held underwater for a long time and was now back at the surface. She was, she realized, furious. Not at him. Or not only at him. At the situation. At the specific and infuriating truth that the person who had the resources and the position and the military capacity to do what she needed done was sitting 3 feet away from her in this room and had been 3 feet away from her, or 40 feet, or in the next corridor, for 5 years while she had been carrying this alone. At the waste of it. At the cost of it. At what it had taken from her. The 5 years of a life spent in gray dresses and cracked hands, and the relentless maintenance of a self that couldn't be herself, and all of it because she hadn't had what she needed and had refused to reach for anything she didn't have. You've known for years that the treaty was forged, she said. Yes. And you've been preparing a northern campaign. Yes. And you've been doing all of this while I was in your household cleaning your floors. Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt exactly. The specific expression of a man who is recognizing a dimension of a situation he had not previously been positioned to see. I didn't know you were in my household. No. She looked at the fire. But Malgrath's been running a war using my name for 6 years, and you've known the treaty was forged, and you didn't. She stopped. She breathed. She was not going to have this particular argument right now because the argument was not the point, and emotion was not the point, and the 5 years of this were not the point. What are your terms? Simple ones for now. You stay, not as Mila, as yourself. I extend formal protection to you as a political ally and legitimate claimant. You provide me with the intelligence you've gathered. We jointly pursue the Harwick situation, and in 3 months, when the spring campaign season opens and the passes are clear, we move north. Together. Together. The word sat between them with more weight than it carried structurally. They were both aware of it. Neither of them acknowledged it directly, because some things in a room between two people who have a bond that neither of them has yet addressed directly are better left to occupy space without being named. There was enough in this room already that was being named for the first time. I'll give you an answer by tonight, she said. I need an answer now. He said it without apology. Because in approximately 2 hours, when the fortress wakes and the morning shifts begin, someone is going to notice that Mila is not in the dormitory and not at her station. And when that inquiry starts, it's going to move fast. I need to know whether you're staying or whether I'm managing a different kind of situation." She looked at him directly. "You'd let me go," she said. "If I said no, I'd let you go." His jaw was set. His eyes were steady. "I'm not in the business of imprisoning women who have survived enough already. But I'd ask you to consider what you're going back to." What she was going back to was a world where Seraphine Valicrest's letter was already written, and Breton Salve was in a locked guest room with nothing to lose, and Malgrath's network on the continent had just had her location confirmed by someone who had been inside these walls. What she was going back to was the thing she'd been running from for 6 years, except now it knew where she was. She stood up. Valor stood with her, the reflex of a man who was raised to it, or possibly the reflex of something older than manners. "I need a room," she said. "Not the dormitory, somewhere I can think for an hour that isn't a corner bed with 15 other women in it." "Done. I need access to those documents I've been collecting. They're in the north storage room behind the linen press on the 3rd floor. There's a loose stone behind the 2nd shelf." Something happened in his expression. "Brief. You've been keeping intelligence documents inside my fortress walls." "For 4 years. Inside my fortress walls. In a loose stone behind a linen press." She held his gaze. "How thorough was your household intelligence review exactly?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Get your documents," he said. "Meet me back here in an hour." She moved toward the door. "Elyria." She stopped. "The bond," he said. Not a question, just the word, just the acknowledgement that it was in the room with them, and had been in the room with them since the corridor outside the war room, and was going to continue to be in any room they occupied until one or both of them decided to address it as something other than a piece of furniture they were walking around. She didn't turn around. "One thing at a time," she said. She left. The north storage room on the 3rd floor was a narrow space that smelled of cedar and old cloth, and the particular dusty cold of a room that was used for storage of things people needed eventually, but never needed urgently. She had worked in it dozens of times over 5 years. The linen press was the large freestanding cabinet on the east wall, and the 2nd shelf from the bottom held extra table linens for the formal dining service. And behind that shelf, in the cavity between the shelf and the stone wall, she had spent 4 years building a record. She pulled the shelf forward, reached into the cavity, and removed the wrapped package she found there. It was heavier than it had been the last time she'd added to it. The outside was oilcloth, salvaged from a disused rain cloak, and the inside was paper, pages she'd accumulated one at a time over 4 years, copied by hand in the 20 minutes between the end of the night cleaning rotation and the start of the dormitory sleep period. Fragments of diplomatic correspondence she'd managed to read in the brief window between delivery and filing. Notes on supply movements. A partial record of Harwick's secondary income, traced through 3 years of observed behavior and overheard fragments. She held the package against her chest for a moment. This was the thing she had built in the years since the night her mother died. Not a kingdom, not an army, not anything that looked from outside like the resources of a woman preparing to reclaim a throne. Just paper. Just information. Just the slow, careful accumulation of knowledge by a woman who had understood, from the first night she'd spent on a servant's cot in the dormitory of an enemy fortress, that knowledge was the only currency that couldn't be taken from her. She was still holding it when she heard the door of the storage room open behind her. She turned fast, the package still in her hands, and the woman standing in the doorway was not Valor, was not a guard, was not anyone she would have chosen to encounter in this room at this moment. Seraphine Valicrest was wearing a morning robe and a very calm expression, and she was alone, and she was holding a sealed letter that Elyria recognized because she had seen it being written the previous night, in the window of Seraphine's guest room, from the position of the internal courtyard below. She had seen it. She had not been able to stop it. "Good morning," Seraphine said. Elyria said nothing. "I sent that letter at the 2nd bell," Seraphine said, gesturing with the letter in a way that was almost casual. Almost. "You should know that. Malgrath's network has a relay point in the first northern town. The information about your location will reach him by nightfall. His hunters travel fast." She tilted her head. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand the shape of the situation you're in." "What do you want?" "I want you gone." Seraphine said it with the precision of someone stating a position at the beginning of a negotiation. Not with rage, not with the dramatic malice of a theatrical villain, with the specific, measured clarity of a woman who has identified an obstacle and is in the process of removing it. I want you gone, and I want you to leave in a way that doesn't complicate what I've been building here for 3 years. If you leave voluntarily, today, before the fortress wakes, before Valor has the opportunity to formalize whatever he's discussed with you this morning, I'll send a second letter to the relay point countermanding the first. And if I don't? Seraphine's expression didn't change. Then Malgrath's hunters will be here in 3 days, and I'll make sure they know exactly where to find you. Elyria looked at the woman in the doorway. She had known in the abstract that Seraphine was dangerous. 5 years of observing the court from its edges had given her a thorough education in who in Vialor's inner circle wielded real influence versus performed influence. And Seraphine was the kind of woman who was underestimated by people who confused warmth with softness. She was not warm. She was very patient, which was a different quality entirely, and considerably more dangerous. But there was something happening in this moment that Seraphine, for all her calculation, had not accounted for. Elyria was not the woman she had been at midnight. Something had changed in the hour between the east corridor door and the storage room. Some weight had been set down. Not the weight of survival. That was still there, would always be there, was woven into her by now. But the specific weight of a woman carrying her true name in secret in a world that had given her no space to set it down. Valor had said her name twice. She had heard it in his voice. And the architecture of 5 years of suppression had done something it had never done before. It had cracked, not collapsed, not shattered, cracked, a line running through the careful structure she had built over survival. And through that crack, something older than survival was pushing through. She looked at Seraphine Valacrest. "Send your letters," she said. Seraphine blinked. It was the first involuntary thing Elyria had seen her do. "You should understand what that means," Seraphine said. "I understand exactly what it means." She tucked the oilcloth package under her arm and walked toward the door. "It means I have 3 days before hunters arrive. That's enough time." She stopped in the doorway, close enough to the other woman that she could see the calculation happening behind those pale green eyes. "Move." Seraphine moved. Elyria walked out of the storage room and turned toward the stairs. Behind her, she heard Seraphine say quietly to the empty corridor, "You have no idea what you're walking into." She didn't stop. She had been walking into things she had no idea about for 6 years. She had gotten exceptionally good at it. Valor was at his desk when she returned, a different set of documents spread before him. She recognized the household records she'd heard him request at the first bell. He looked up when she came in. His eyes went to the oilcloth package under her arm and stayed there for a beat before moving to her face. He read something in her face. "What happened?" he said. "Seraphine Valcrest sent a letter to Malgrath's Northern Relay at the second bell last night." She set the package on the desk between them. "His hunters will be at the fortress within 3 days." Absolute silence. She watched the shift happen in him. The specific transition from the man who had been in this room conducting a careful bilateral conversation about political strategy to the Alpha King processing an active threat to something he had already, in the span of a single morning, categorized as under his protection. It was not a dramatic shift. It was more like watching a tide change direction. The same body of water, the same fundamental force, moving differently. "Seraphine," he said, "she's been in your household for 3 years. Elyria pulled out the desk chair across from him and sat in it. Not the peripheral chair she'd occupied before, but the one that put her directly across from him, the chair of a person engaged in a working conversation. "She has access to your guest correspondence routing. She knows your patrol schedules. And she has apparently established contact with Malgrath's network independently of whatever your official diplomatic channels look like." He was very still. "She told you this herself," he said. "She came to warn me, or to threaten me, depending on how you look at it. She believes I'll leave." Elyria met his gaze. "I'm not leaving." Something happened in his expression when she said it. She did not examine it closely. There was not time to examine it closely. 3 days, he said. "If the relay works as she described, could be less." He stood. He was already moving, the physical manifestation of a military mind that had just shifted into operational mode. He moved to the door, opened it, and she heard him speak to someone in the corridor outside. Quick, precise instructions she didn't fully catch. Names, locations, time references. He came back in and closed the door. "I'm moving you to the East Tower," he said. "It's defensible and it's not on any map Seraphine would have accessed. I'm also placing Seraphine Valicrest under house restriction pending investigation." "She'll deny the letter. She'll deny it and I'll investigate it anyway." He came back to the desk and braced his hands on the surface and looked at her across the oilcloth package. "You said 3 days. We don't have 3 days to build a formal campaign plan. But we can be in position in 3 days. If Malgrath's hunters cross into my territory, they become my problem to deal with, not yours." She looked up at him. The morning had moved. The window behind him showed a sky that had graduated from non-committal white to a pale and watery gold, the sun arriving with the specific half-heartedness of early spring, as though it too had reservations about the day. "You're committing to this," she said, "based on one conversation." "Based on 5 years," he said, "and one conversation." He held her gaze. "Do you trust me?" The question landed with all the weight of a question that could not be answered easily, and both of them knew it. Trust was not a thing she had been able to afford in 6 years. Trust was the thing that had cost her mother her life. Not the obvious trust, the trust in strangers, but the specific intimate trust in advisors and council members, and the internal architecture of an empire that had seemed impenetrable right up until the moment it wasn't. She had not trusted anyone in 6 years. She had survived because of it. But survival, she was beginning to understand with the slow, terrible clarity of someone who has been running for long enough that stopping finally becomes unavoidable, was not the same thing as living. "Not yet," she said. It was the most honest thing she had said in 6 years. "But I'm here, and I'm staying, and I'm willing to get there." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's enough," he said. He reached across his desk and opened the oilcloth package without asking permission. The papers inside fanned across the desk surface. 4 years of her work, her risk, her small daily acts of intelligence that had looked, from outside, like nothing more than a servant being unusually thorough about the rooms she cleaned. She watched him begin to read. She watched his face as he read. Outside, the fortress was waking up. She could hear it. The shift changes, the first sounds of the kitchens beginning the day's work. The distant movement of a household that had no idea what the morning contained. Somewhere in that household, Seraphine Valicrest was conducting a calculation. Somewhere 3 days north, Malgrath's hunters were, at this very moment, receiving a message. And in the East Tower, a room was being prepared for a woman who had spent 5 years being no one. She was not no one anymore. That was, she understood with the clarity of someone who has just stepped off a ledge and is waiting to find out if there is ground below, the most dangerous thing that had happened to her in 6 years. Not the hunters, not the letter, not the 3 days. The most dangerous thing was this, that she had said her name aloud, and the Alpha King had said it back. And somewhere in the territory of that exchange, the ghost had stopped being a ghost. The woman had returned, and the world that had spent 6 years trying to erase her was about to find out what that meant. At the second hour of morning, a rider left the fortress's eastern gate at full gallop, heading north. He was not one of Valor's men. He wore no livery. He carried, in a leather tube strapped to his saddle, a letter that had been written the night before, sealed with dark wax, addressed to a relay point 3 hours north. The first link in a chain that ended at the court of the man who had been hunting a dead Empress's daughter for 6 years. The rider was fast. The road was clear. And at the fortress gates, the morning guard watched him go and thought nothing of it, because morning riders were common, and the gate log showed a departure authorized under a guest name, and nobody had yet told the gate guard that guest travel had been restricted pending the king's morning review. Nobody had told them, because the order hadn't been given yet. The order hadn't been given yet because Valor had not known about the letter until 3 minutes ago. 3 minutes was enough time for a fast rider to be out of sight. And out of sight, on a clear northern road with a 6-hour lead, was enough of a head start to matter. 3 days had just become less. The rider had 6 hours. Valor stood at the window of his private study and looked at the empty northern road and did the math with the cold efficiency of a man who had been calculating military timelines since he was 14 years old. 6 hours to the relay. An hour at the relay for the message to be transcribed and handed off to the next courier. Another 4 hours to the border garrison, where Malgrath's hunters maintained a permanent presence under the diplomatic fiction of a trade protection detail. Call it 12 hours before the hunters were moving. Call it another 18 before they reached the fortress perimeter, depending on how many he sent and how fast he wanted them traveling. 30 hours. Perhaps 36. Not 3 days. He turned from the window. Elyria was still at the desk, reading through the documents he'd set aside during his assessment of her intelligence package. The household records, the supply manifests, the partial correspondence she'd managed to copy across 4 years of careful, dangerous, methodical work. She read the way she did everything he'd observed so far, without wasted motion. Her eyes moved down the page, and she turned it and moved to the next one, and she did not look up when he came back to the desk, and she did not ask him what he'd calculated, because she had already calculated it herself, and they both knew it. 30 hours, she said, without looking up. Approximately. That changes things. It changes the timeline. The plan stays the same. He sat. I'm accelerating the departure window. We move in 24 hours instead of 72. I need you to walk me through everything you have on Malgrath's border garrison. Numbers, rotation patterns, any intelligence on the hunting parties he deploys specifically. She set down the document she was reading. There's something else, she said. He waited. The Harwick material. She reached into the stack and pulled a specific set of pages. Older paper, more worn at the edges, the ones she'd been adding to longest. She laid them on the desk between them. 3 years ago, I intercepted a fragment of correspondence that I couldn't fully read because the courier retrieved it before I finished. I copied what I could. At the time, the reference was to a payment arrangement, standard enough that I filed it as financial corruption and moved on. She looked at him. Reading it again now, in the context of everything else, the accelerated timing of Seraphine's letter, the specific information she had about the relay point, which is not public knowledge, I think Harwick and Seraphine have been coordinating. Brahmas. He was very still. Show me. She pointed to the relevant section of the copied fragment. He read it. He read it a second time. His expression did not change in the way that most men's expressions changed when they received bad news. He did not go pale, did not tighten visibly, did not make any of the small involuntary adjustments that betrayed shock in most people. What happened instead was a quality of stillness that was more total than before. The way a room goes quieter when something large has stopped moving inside it. Seraphine has been receiving payments from the same proxy account as Harwick, he said, for at least 2 years. Possibly longer. I only have the one fragment, but the account reference matches. She kept her voice even. The political campaign she's been running here, the campaign for your attention, your court position, that's been the cover for something considerably more structured. He stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there for a long time. This was the specific architecture of deep betrayal, not the clean, obvious betrayal of an enemy you can see coming, but the particular structural collapse that happens when someone you have permitted inside your walls has been, the entire time, a load-bearing piece of someone else's design. Seraphine Valicrest had spent 3 years inside his court building, a position that looked, from every external angle, like personal ambition. She had been visible in her ambition, which was its own form of cover. A woman openly pursuing power was a woman whose other activities were less scrutinized. She had been, he now understood, precisely as transparent as she needed to be to keep his intelligence apparatus focused on the performance rather than the structure underneath it. There is a particular lesson that power teaches slowly and at great cost, that the most dangerous adversaries are not the ones who attack you from outside. They are the ones who learn to inhabit your trust so completely that their activities inside your defenses look indistinguishable from loyalty. Every empire in history has been brought lower by intimacy than by invasion. Every ruler who has fallen, at least partially, because something he permitted close to him was not what it appeared. Veilor had known this. He had known it the way all rulers know it. Theoretically, structurally, as a principle he applied to everyone he observed. He had applied it rigorously to his council, to his military command, to his diplomatic relationships. He had not applied it rigorously enough to his personal court, because personal courts are where human need lives. The need for something that isn't purely functional. The need for the company of people who are present, not because they hold a military rank or a council seat, but because they have been admitted into the space that isn't about governance. That space is always the softest point. That space is always where the architects of long-term infiltration aim. He turned back from the window. I want Seraphine in the East Conference Room in 20 minutes, he said. Alone. No attendance. She was already dressed when they brought her. That was the first thing Valor registered when he entered the East Conference Room and found her seated at the table. Not the expression on her face or the way she held herself, but the fact that she had been dressed and ready before his people came to escort her. She had known, or prepared for the possibility, that this summons was coming. Her morning robe from the storage room encounter had been replaced with a formal day dress, her hair arranged, her face composed in the specific expression of a woman who has decided, in whatever time she had between the storage room and this room, exactly how she intends to play this. She was very good at this. He gave her that. He sat across from her. He did not bring the documents. He did not lay evidence on the table between them and explain what it meant. He had learned, through years of conducting difficult conversations in rooms like this, that the most productive version of this particular exchange was the one where the other person did most of the talking. Seraphine, he said, my lord, perfectly calibrated, warm without being inappropriately familiar, present without being defensive. Tell me about your relationship with the Corvin Trading Group. A beat. Smaller than a normal beat, but present. I have several business interests in the Northern Trade Corridor. Corvin is one of the proxy groups I invest through. It's not unusual for noble families in this region to. Corvin is a financial shell managed by an accounting firm in the eastern port city that has for 6 years been documented as the primary payment mechanism for Malgrath Voss's Continental Intelligence Network. He said it the way he said most things that mattered, without elevation, without drama, at the exact volume and temperature of a man stating a fact he does not feel the need to perform around. Which you know. She looked at him. Something happened in her eyes. The composure was still there. It was extraordinary composure, he could admit that. But underneath it, something had moved. The specific internal adjustment of a person who has been caught in a lie they had carefully constructed not to look like one. That's a significant accusation, she said. It's not an accusation yet, it's a question. How long have you been receiving payments from Corvin, and what was the arrangement? I invest through Corvin. I receive returns on those investments. That's not... Seraphine? His voice didn't rise, it just became more absolute, the way a door becomes more closed when you remove any possibility of it opening. I have 4 years of documented financial records and correspondence fragments that establish a pattern. I have a relay point reference that you used this morning that is not available through public channels. It's an internal diplomatic routing code that exists in exactly 3 documents in this fortress, all of which are classified at the senior council level. Harwick has access to those documents. You do not, through any legitimate channel. He leaned forward. So either Harwick gave it to you, or Malgrath's network gave it to you directly. Those are the only 2 options. Tell me which one. The silence that followed was not the silence of innocence. It was the silence of someone making a final calculation. You moved quickly, she said, finally. The warmth was gone from her voice. What was left was something considerably more real, not cold exactly, but direct in the way that cold sometimes expresses directness. I didn't expect you to have the full picture by morning. I didn't. I had a partial picture and I filled in the gaps just now by watching your face. Her jaw tightened. It was, he thought, the most uncontrolled thing he'd seen her do. How long? He said. 2 years. She said it without looking away. Whatever composure remained had reorganized itself around honesty rather than deflection, or around the appearance of honesty, which was, in his experience, what people who had been operating in the space between truth and performance defaulted to when the performance failed. Harwick approached me. He framed it as an investment opportunity, and I understood what it actually was, and I chose to engage because I understood that Malgrath's position in the north was going to become relevant to this court's interests, and I wanted to be positioned to matter when that happened. You wanted to be positioned to matter, he repeated. I've spent 3 years in your court, Valor. The formality slipped, and for just a moment he could see behind it the specific, exhausted anger of a woman who had been conducting an enormously complicated long-term strategy and is now watching it dismantle in real time. 3 years of being present and intelligent and useful, and I have been treated as a social accessory. I wanted leverage. I found leverage. You use that leverage to send a location to a man who has a kill order on an innocent woman. Something shifted in her expression. She's not innocent, Seraphine said. She's been in your household for 5 years feeding intelligence back to whoever she answers to. She answers to herself. And what she's been doing is surviving. His voice was still level. It was taking effort. You've been in my court long enough to understand the difference between a political actor and a survivor. Don't pretend you can't make that distinction. It doesn't matter what she is. And now the composure cracked in a different direction, not toward honesty, but toward the thing that had been driving all of it. The specific focused heat of a person who has been running a long game and is furious that it has been interrupted. What matters is that you looked at her the way you have never once looked at anyone in 3 years of shared space. And she has been here for 5 hours, and she is already changing the calculation of everything I've spent 2 years building. I sent the letter because she is a threat. I sent it because you cannot see that she's a threat. And I sent it because Malgrath's hunters are more useful to me than an open confrontation in your court where you clearly have already decided which side you're on. The room was very quiet. Vialor looked at her for a long moment. He had known ambitious people his entire life. He had known people who pursued power with the specific single-minded focus that excluded most other considerations, who made decisions that other people would call ruthless, but who experienced those decisions as simply rational, as the obvious next step in the pursuit of a clearly defined objective. He was not a stranger to that psychology. He had, at various points in his life, been that psychology. What he was looking at across this table was something slightly different, not pure ambition. Ambition had a kind of clarity to it, a consistency of purpose that made it predictable, if not always admirable. What he was looking at was ambition that had been operating for so long in the absence of any genuine connection that it had forgotten the difference between a person and a resource. Seraphine had not set out, probably, to become an agent of a tyrant. She had set out to acquire leverage, and the specific leverage available to her had been Malgrath's network, and she had engaged with it, and continued engaging with it, and used it this morning against a woman she perceived as competition without stopping to examine what, exactly, she had become in the process. Power without conscience is not just a moral failure, it is a structural one. It produces decisions that are locally optimal and systemically catastrophic, the kind of decisions that make sense in the moment of the calculation and produce disasters at the scale of the consequence. You're confined to your guest quarters, he said. You'll be moved to a secure room before nightfall pending a formal investigation. Your communication privileges are suspended effective immediately. He stood. I want to be clear about something, not as your king, as the person sitting across this table from you. He looked at her directly. Whatever you thought you were doing, whatever the calculation was, you sent a woman who has survived 6 years of being hunted back into the sights of the man who's been hunting her. That is what the morning's balance sheet actually says. I hope the leverage was worth it. He left. The East Tower room was smaller than her dormitory, but it had one window and a working fire and a door that locked from the inside, which was, Elyria reflected, a significant upgrade. She had spent the hour since the study meeting sitting at the small table near the window with Vialor's map spread before her, and her own papers alongside them, building a picture of the northern corridor from the 2 incomplete perspectives they each held. Her intelligence on Malgrath's border garrison was operational. Numbers, patrol patterns, the specific blind spots in the Northern Pass surveillance that she'd pieced together from 3 years of intercepted supply communications. His intelligence was strategic, the larger territorial picture, the alliance relationships, the political weight of each player in the Northern Coalition. Together, they made a more complete map than either had separately. She was still looking at that map when the knock came and Vialor entered with the specific energy of a man who has just done something unpleasant and is converting the residue into forward motion. Seraphine, she said. Not a question. Confined. Under investigation. He came to the table and looked at the map she'd laid out. Something in his posture changed, the same shift she'd seen in the study that morning, the transition from one mode of operating to another. Tell me what you found. The garrison at Dreven Post runs a rotation of 60 permanent hunters, with a surge capacity of 200 drawn from the northern border regiments. Malgrath's personal hunting parties are typically 12 to 20, fast, mobile, equipped for capture rather than kill, which tells you something about what he wants from this. She moved her finger along the map. There's a route through the Kelvar Pass that bypasses the main road entirely. It adds 4 hours to the transit time, but it avoids the garrison's standard interception zone. If your people know it, my people know it. He was studying the map with his hands braced on the table edge. It's the same route I've been planning to use for the Northern Campaign's opening movement. Then we're looking at the same geography for two different reasons. Not different reasons. He looked at her. The same reason. Approached from two directions. A pause. If we move in 18 hours instead of 24, we get ahead of the hunters by a full rotation cycle. They'll be moving toward us on the main road while we're already through the pass. She looked at the map. She ran the calculation. That requires your Wolf Legion to be ready to move in 18 hours. They've been in readiness posture for 3 weeks. This isn't a mobilization. It's an execution of a plan that's already been built. He straightened. The question is the legal architecture. If I move north before I've formally established your claim in front of the other kingdoms, it still reads as unilateral action on my part, which Malgrath will exploit in every diplomatic channel he has. Then we establish it before we leave. She had been thinking about this since the study. You have a council session scheduled for this afternoon. I do. Call it early. I'll present myself formally. Full lineage, full claim, with documentation. She met his gaze. You said you have copies of my mother's archived documents. If those are available, the legal basis for my claim can be established in front of your council in 2 hours. Whatever Harwick tries to do with it, the record exists. Harwick will try to dispute it. Of course he will. But disputing a documented lineage claim in front of a full council takes time and legal process that he doesn't have in 2 hours. She paused. It also tells you which other council members are in his pocket. Useful information. He looked at her. Something moved across his expression that she was beginning to recognize. Not surprise exactly, but the specific recalibration of a man encountering, repeatedly, the gap between what he expected a particular person to be capable of and what that person actually produced. You've been planning a legal strategy, he said. I've been planning a legal strategy for 4 years, she said. I just never had the room to execute it. The council chamber was a long rectangular room with a stone table that had been in the fortress since before Valor's father's time. Old enough that the surface had developed the specific smoothness of wood that has absorbed decades of hands and documents and the weight of decisions. 9 council seats. 7 present, 2 empty, for different reasons. Valor at the head. Harwick 3 seats to his left. A broad-shouldered man in his late 50s whose face had the specific architecture of someone who had been performing affability as political strategy for so long that the performance had begun to look structural. Elyria stood at the far end of the table. She was still wearing the servant's dress. She had considered asking for different clothes and rejected the consideration, because the servant's dress was not a liability in this moment. It was evidence. It was the physical argument she was making before she said a word, that a woman in a gray dress with cracked knuckles and 5 years of cold floors behind her was standing at the council table of the most powerful Alpha Kingdom on the continent and asking them to recognize a claim that had more legal weight than anyone in this room had been positioned to exercise on her behalf while she was scrubbing their corridors. She placed her documentation on the table. She said her name. She said it the way her mother had taught her to say it, not loudly, not with performance, but with the specific quality of absoluteness that a name carries, when the person saying it knows exactly what it is and is done pretending otherwise. The room was very quiet. She laid out the lineage. She laid out the documentation. She laid out, in the specific and well-organized language of someone who had been building this argument for 4 years without knowing exactly when she'd be making it, the legal basis for her claim to the Velthari throne, the evidence of Malgrath's forged treaty, and the record of 6 years of border provocations conducted under her stolen name. She was 4 minutes into the presentation when Harwick spoke. "This is theater," he said. His voice was controlled, dismissive. the voice of a man deploying skepticism as authority. We have no way to verify these documents on short notice. A woman appears from the household staff claiming imperial lineage. The council has an obligation to conduct a full verification process before any formal recognition can. Counselor Harwick. Valor's voice was quiet, completely quiet. The quiet of something very large choosing, for the moment, not to move. You've seen the archived documents from the Velthari Imperial Library. You've had access to them for 3 years. If you have a specific objection to the lineage claim, state it with reference to those archives. Otherwise, I'd ask you to allow the presentation to continue. A silence. Harwick's face did something complicated. The performance of skepticism remained, but underneath it something had shifted. The specific internal adjustment of a man who has just been told, without being told explicitly, that the person across the table knows more about his position than he has revealed. He said nothing more. She finished the presentation. When she was done, Valor looked down the table at his counsel. Objections, he said. Specific, documented, legally grounded objections. Now. 3 council members spoke. Minor procedural points, the reasonable caution of people who had not had time to process what they were being asked to recognize. She answered each one. The answers were ready because she had been constructing them for 4 years. The council members who had raised the procedural points were satisfied. Harwick did not speak again. The formal recognition passed 5-1. Harwick's was the single dissenting vote. He cast it with the specific controlled blankness of a man who knows that his position has just become significantly more dangerous and is deciding how quickly he needs to act. Elyria watched him cast it. She watched him stand when the session was called and move toward the chamber door with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who was not leaving urgently but was absolutely leaving. She looked at Valor. He had already seen it. He gave a small nod to the guard at the chamber door, a nod that meant something specific, that she understood was an instruction she was not privy to the content of. The guard moved. Harwick reached the door. The guard was already on the other side of it. The door opened, and in the corridor beyond, Elyria caught a glimpse, just a glimpse, through the open doorway, of the small folded paper that fell from Harwick's sleeve as his hand touched the doorframe, and of the guard's boot coming down on it before it could slide. Not a guard's reflex. A planned interception. Valor had known Harwick would try to communicate. He had positioned someone to catch it. The chamber door closed. She turned to find Valor already on his feet, moving toward the side exit. He glanced back at her once. "Stay here," he said. She did not stay there. The corridor outside the chamber was a short conflict, not a fight, because Harwick was a politician and not a soldier, and the 3 men Valor had stationed outside the door were neither of those things, but were something considerably more practically effective. By the time she came through the side exit and rounded the corner, it was already resolved. Harwick was standing against the corridor wall with his wrists held by 2 of the guards, and the folded paper was in Valor's hand, and he was reading it with the expression of a man who is confirming something he already knew, but is nevertheless made colder by the confirmation. He looked up at her. "He sent a second rider an hour ago," he said, "before the council session, triggered from the gate on a supply-run authorization that bypassed the standard communication review." His voice was completely flat. "The message is a location update, revised intelligence on where you'd be positioned, and the timing of our planned departure." Elyria looked at Harwick. He was a man in his late 50s, and he was pale in the specific way that men go pale when the calculation they've been running for years has just terminated at a result they didn't intend. He was not, she thought, a man who had set out to be what he'd become. He was a man who had made a series of decisions, each one locally defensible, each one building on the last, until the cumulative structure of those decisions had become something that could not be disassembled without consequences he couldn't accept. That was how it usually went. That was how most betrayals worked, not as single dramatic choices, but as the slow accumulation of smaller ones, each small enough to rationalize, until the rationalizations had built a wall between the person who started making them and any possible exit. There was no philosophy that made this clean. That was the specific cruelty of betrayal enacted by men like Harwick. It could be understood. Its internal logic could be reconstructed, but understanding it did nothing to mitigate its cost. Understanding a fracture does not repair it. Understanding the reason the roof collapsed does not shelter you from the rain. How long? Valor said to Harwick. Harwick said nothing. How long have you been reporting to Malgrath's network? Still nothing. The financial record goes back 3 years, Valor said. What I need to know is what else you've given them, beyond the treaty routing codes, beyond the patrol schedules that I'm now assuming were compromised, beyond whatever you've given them about the Northern campaign preparation. He took a step closer. Tell me what they know. Harwick looked at the wall. He had the specific expression of a man who has calculated that silence is still his best available option and is holding to it with the last of his dignity. Valor looked at the guard on Harwick's right. Take him to the secure room next to Seraphine Valcrests, he said. No communication. No visitors. Inventory everything in his chambers and bring me anything that looks like correspondence. He looked at Harwick one more time. We'll finish this conversation when I'm back. He turned. He was walking fast now. Not running. The Alpha King did not run through his own corridors, but moving with the specific compressed urgency of a man who has just had the timeline of an already urgent situation become significantly more compressed. Elyria kept pace beside him. What did the message say? She said. Specifically, that you'd been formally recognized by the Council, that we're planning a northern departure within 24 hours, that the Kelvar Pass is likely our route. He turned the corner toward the East Tower stairwell. All of which means Malgrath's hunters are not coming to the fortress. She understood a half-second before he said it. They're going to the pass, she said. They're going to the pass. He pushed open the stairwell door, which means 18 hours just became something we don't have. They were on the stairs when she said it. The thing she'd been calculating since the corridor, since she'd seen the folded paper in his hand, since the specific weight of the situation had assembled itself into its new shape. The plan has to change, she said. I know. All of it. The route. The timing. The formation. She was thinking out loud now, the way she'd learned to think in the years of solitary strategy, speaking the analysis at the speed it arrived, trusting that the person listening could keep up. They know the pass. They know the timeline. They don't know what we know. That Harwick's message was intercepted. That we know they know. She looked at him. That's the only advantage we have left. And it's a small one. We have to use it before they realize the message didn't do what it was supposed to do. He stopped on the stairwell landing. He turned to face her. He was looking at her with that quality of attention again. The one that had been doing things to her management of the bond since the storage room, since the conference room, since the specific moment when the ghost had stopped being a ghost, and she had not yet developed a new system for handling the consequences. What are you proposing? He said. She had been afraid since the dormitory, since the corridor, since the study where she'd drunk half a cup of bitter coffee and told him 6 years of operational history in a servant's voice. She had been afraid with the deep, cold, hollow fear of a woman who understood exactly how much she had to lose and had already lost almost everything once. She was done being afraid, not because the fear had gone, because she had, in the architecture of this specific morning, run out of the option to let it govern her. The hunters were going to the pass. Harwick's message had given them everything. The ghost had been seen, and the queen had been named, and there was no corridor left to disappear into, no loose stone behind any linen press that held enough paper to make a plan from, no gap in any patrol rotation that opened onto a landscape where surviving as no one was still possible. The world she'd been surviving in for 6 years had just closed behind her like a door. The world on the other side of it was the one she'd been running from since the night her mother died, and the cost of entering it was becoming finally and completely herself. She was not sure she remembered how to do that. She was going to do it anyway. I'm proposing, she said, that we don't use the pass. He waited. We use the main road, she said, openly, formally, with full military escort and my claim flying on every banner. She held his gaze. Malgrath's hunters are positioned for a covert extraction through a mountain pass. They are not positioned for a formal military column moving under 2 crowns in open territory. We take away their operational framework entirely. A beat. And we do it in 6 hours. The stairwell was cold. The stone held the night's temperature well into the morning. Valor looked at her. If we move openly, he said, there's no tactical cover. If he has forces beyond the hunters, he'll hesitate. She said it with the certainty of someone who had spent 6 years studying the man from the intelligence available to her. Malgrath does not commit to open military conflict without a legal pretext. He's been manufacturing them under my name for 6 years because he needs them. A formal column under your authority, and my recognized claim removes every legal pretext he has. He will hesitate, and hesitation is the only window we need. A long silence. She could see him running it. The military calculation, the political calculation, the calculation about what it cost against what it might gain. She could see him reaching the same place she had reached, the place where every other option had been foreclosed, where the only move left was the one that required abandoning the thing she'd spent years protecting. Elyria. His voice was different. The quality of it had changed. Not the king, not the strategist, the man she'd heard standing in the corridor outside the war room a lifetime ago. If we do this, if we move openly, there is no coming back to what you've been. There's no version of this where you are ever again the woman who knows how to be invisible. She looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. She started up the stairs. I have to change clothes, she said over her shoulder. I can't reclaim a throne in this dress. Behind her, she heard something that might have been, from the Alpha King of the Obsidian Fortress, the first real sound of a man who had not laughed, genuinely, unguardedly laughed, in a very long time. But she did not look back to confirm it. Because queens, her mother had told her once, don't look back. They look forward. They always look forward. Even when what's in front of them is the most dangerous ground they've ever had to cross. The dress was sapphire blue. Not the blue of clear water or summer sky. Those were gentle things, things that invited comfort. This was the blue of deep ocean at the point where light no longer reached the bottom. The blue that existed at the precise boundary between the known and the unknowable. It had been her mother's formal court color, the Velthari imperial signature that every diplomatic record and portrait in every archive on the continent would identify on sight. She had not seen it in 6 years. She had not expected to see it again. Valor's head archivist had found it in the fortress's document storage. Not a dress itself, but 3 yards of Velthari ceremonial silk that had arrived 17 years ago as a diplomatic gift from the Empress and had been stored with the kind of careful bureaucratic preservation that old empires inspired even in their rivals. One of the senior seamstresses had been brought to the East Tower at the 5th bell with specific instructions and no explanations, and had worked in focused, unquestioning silence for 2 hours, and had produced something that was not a court gown in the traditional sense. There was no time for a court gown, but was instead the specific combination of structure and color that communicated what it needed to communicate. That a queen had dressed herself for a road, not a throne room. Elyria stood in front of the East Tower's small polished mirror and looked at the woman looking back at her. She had not looked at herself directly in 6 years either. Not really. Not the way she was looking now, with the specific quality of attention that required acknowledging what was there rather than cataloging the adjustments needed to make it less visible. The woman in the mirror had the same face she remembered from before. The same bone structure, the same eyes, the same mouth that her mother had always said was too direct for a court and precisely correct for an empress. What was different was the area around all of those features. The specific quality of someone who has spent 6 years in a condition of sustained restraint and has, in the last 8 hours, put that restraint down. She looked like herself. She was not entirely sure she was ready for that. She put on the dress anyway. But the courtyard assembly took 43 minutes from the first order to the last boot in the stirrup, which was, by every standard military metric, exceptional. 21 of the Alpha Guard, Valor's personal Wolf Legion, the hand-picked elite of a force that had been in continuous readiness for 3 weeks, were formed and mounted in the fortress's main yard with the efficiency of people who had been waiting for exactly this kind of activation and were not interested in wasting the moment. The horses were the large northern breeds that the Draxon line had been developing for 5 generations. Built for endurance over raw speed, capable of sustaining a battle pace across terrain that would break lighter cavalry. Elyria was given a gray mare with the specific temperament of an animal that had been trained to stay calm when everything around it wasn't. She approved of this choice. She had not ridden in 6 years, but the body remembered what the mind filed away. The balance, the contact, the specific distributed weight adjustment that translated intention into direction. She settled into the saddle, and the mare did not object. Vaelor was already mounted when she came down from the East Tower. He was in full field armor, not the ceremonial version that made kings look imposing in portraits, but the functional version that made them hard to kill in the field. Dark steel, no ornamentation, the specific design of a man who had spent enough time in actual combat to have strong opinions about what armor needed to do, and no patience for anything that prioritized appearance over those opinions. He looked at her when she came through the courtyard gate. His eyes moved from the dress to her face and stayed there. He said nothing. She rode to a position beside him. "Formation," she said. "You're in the center. Aldrich's forward element takes point, 6 wolves, 2 flanking columns of 4, 6 rear guard." He glanced at her. "I'm riding beside you. That positions you poorly if there's a frontal engagement." "I'm aware." She looked at him. He looked forward at the gate. The conversation was closed. Commander Aldrich Fenbrook was at the head of the forward column, and he turned his horse to face the formation for a single moment before the gate opened. Not for a speech, not for ceremony, but for the specific look that experienced officers gave their people before a movement that might go wrong. A look that said, "I see you. I know what I'm asking. I'm asking it anyway because the alternative is worse." His people looked back with the expression of people who understood exactly that calculus and had already made their peace with it. The gate opened. The column moved onto the northern road. They were 30 minutes out from the fortress when Aldrich's forward scouts returned with the first contact report. The scouts were moving fast, their horses lathered, their faces holding the specific expression of people who have seen something and are deciding how to phrase it. They pulled up alongside Aldrich, exchanged a few rapid words, and Aldrich dropped back to ride at Vaelor's left, while Elyria maintained position on his right. 12 riders, Aldrich said, without preamble. "North road, 3 miles out. Moving toward us, not waiting. They've spread across the road, blocking formation, not pursuit formation. They knew we'd be on the main road." Vaelor's jaw set. Malgrath got word faster than the hunters. "Harwick's second message went out before we intercepted the first." Elyria said it flat, running the timeline. "He must have sent 2 simultaneously. We caught the one Malgrath's network was meant to receive. The one that activated the blocking formation got through clean. 12 riders, blocking formation." She knew what blocking formations meant in Malgrath's operational vocabulary. She had been studying that vocabulary for 4 years. 12 was not an extraction force. 12 was a show of presence designed to create a negotiation moment, to stop a column and create a pause in which other forces could close from secondary positions. 12 visible riders meant 20 or 30 invisible ones within a mile. "How far back are his main forces?" she asked Aldrich. Scouts didn't get a full picture. "Estimate 30 riders total in the immediate zone. Could be more in the tree line on the east ridge." "There are more in the tree line," she said. "He always positions on the ridge. It's the highest point with sight lines on the road below and cover from direct engagement. He uses it as a command position and as a reserve staging point." She looked at Vaelor. "If he has 30 on the road and ridge combined, he has another 30 somewhere we can't see yet. His hunter units run in pairs. 1 visible, 1 not." A pause. 60 total, Vaelor said, "at minimum." They were 21-1. This was not, in the strict arithmetic of military engagements, a favorable ratio. This was in fact the kind of ratio that in most tactical analyses produced a recommendation to not engage, to hold position, to seek different terrain or wait for reinforcement. Vaelor did not suggest holding position. Elyria did not suggest it either, because the specific lesson that both of them had learned, in their very different ways in very different contexts, was that the moment you stop moving forward in a situation where the alternative is being stopped by someone else's design, you have handed the initiative to whoever built that design. An initiative, once surrendered to an opponent who has been planning for longer than you have, is almost impossible to recover. "We ride through," Vaelor said. Aldrich absorbed this. "Through 12 blocking riders. Through them, not around, not after negotiating. Through." He glanced at Elyria. "You said he'll hesitate at open engagement under formal authority. I'm about to test that." She said nothing because there was nothing to say. She had said it because she believed it. She believed it because 6 years of studying Malgrath's pattern had shown her a man who was brilliant at coercion and catastrophically uncomfortable with direct confrontation, who had taken her throne through poison and paperwork rather than open force, who had sustained his border provocations through proxy and plausible deniability rather than declared aggression, who had spent 6 years chasing her with hunters rather than armies, because deploying an army against a refugee empress required a level of explicit ownership of his crimes that he had always been unwilling to commit to. She believed it. She was also aware that belief, in a situation with 60 armed opponents and 21 riders, was a significant thing to be staking a life on. She kept her hand steady on the reins. The column kept moving north. The 12 blocking riders came into view at the crest of a low rise in the road, positioned in a loose line that crossed the full width of the track with the deliberate ease of people who had been waiting and were comfortable in their wait. They were not in Malgrath's colors, they never were, the hunters. It was the whole point of plausible deniability. But the specific quality of their equipment and the way they held their horses and the particular formation they'd taken up told anyone with enough experience to read it exactly who had deployed them and why. The column slowed to a walk. Valor did not raise a hand to slow it. He just changed his pace, and the formation changed with him the way water changes when a stone changes its position in a current. 20 years of combined operational experience between the Alpha Guard and their commander, and they moved as a single body reading a single intent. 40 feet. 30. The lead-blocking rider raised his hand, the universal gesture for stop. Valor did not stop. 20 feet. The blocking rider's horses shifted, the animals reading the approach of 21 horses at a walk that showed no sign of becoming anything other than a walk through the position they were occupying and responding with the specific anxiety of creatures that understood trajectory better than their riders did. 10 feet. The lead rider's horse sidestepped. Valor's column walked through the gap that created and kept moving. There was a moment, 3 seconds, perhaps 4, where nothing happened, where the 12 blocking riders were behind the column and the road ahead was open, and the specific operational assumption that had deployed those 12 riders had just been rendered incorrect, and the people who had made that assumption were adjusting. Elyria heard it before she saw it. The sound from the East Ridge, not a battle cry, not a military order, but the specific sound of a large number of horses being put into motion at once. Not charging, moving to intercept. "East Ridge," she said. "I hear it." Valor's voice was completely calm. "Aldrich." "Forward element accelerating," Aldrich responded from the point position. And then, from the west side of the road, the side that her analysis had identified as the secondary position, the blind side, the place she'd told him Malgrath always kept a reserve, the sound of more horses. Closer than the ridge. Much closer. They'd been in the tree line for longer than the scouts had estimated. "West flank," she said. "I see them." They came out of the tree line at a gallop. Not 12, not 30, but what looked like 50 riders spreading into an arc formation designed to encircle the road in both directions. 50 on the west. More coming down from the ridge on the east. The 12 from the blocking position reorganizing behind them. The road ahead was open for perhaps 30 more seconds. Valor's hand signal was minimal, a single gesture that she hadn't been briefed on, but that the Alpha Guard understood immediately. The forward element drove pace to a gallop. The center column, where she rode, accelerated to match. The rear guard spread outward, creating a wider frame that made the encirclement geometry more difficult to close. They were running, not retreating. Running forward, the specific tactical decision to maintain momentum into whatever was ahead, rather than be consumed by what was closing from behind and both flanks. It was the decision of a man who had calculated that stopping was worse than moving, that the open road ahead held more possibility than the closing trap behind, and who was willing to stake 21 lives on that calculation, including hers. She rode. The ambush point was 3 miles north. She saw it the moment the road crested the next rise, and the geography opened up into the wide, flat section of track that ran through cleared farmland before the forest began again. Flat, open, no cover. The ideal ground for an encirclement engagement, which was why it had been chosen, which was why there were another 40 riders already positioned at the far end of it, waiting for Valor's column to ride into the middle of it before closing from both ends. She did the arithmetic, roughly 100 riders total, against 21. It was not, by the mathematics of it, a survivable engagement, Valor pulled his horse back to match her pace. He was looking at the same geometry she was looking at, running the same numbers, arriving at the same conclusion. "Tell me there's something I'm missing," he said. "There isn't." She looked at the flat ground ahead, the riders waiting at its far end, the sound of pursuit closing from behind. He deployed everything. He wasn't supposed to deploy everything. He was supposed to hesitate. He should have hesitated. He knew about the recognition. Valor's voice was hard. Harwick's message told him the council had formally recognized your claim. That changed his calculus. She understood it a beat after he said it. Malgrath had spent 6 years avoiding open action against her because taking open action against a refugee carried risk, but manageable risk. Refugees had no armies, no formal recognition, no political weight. The moment a recognized claimant with a formal council endorsement entered his operational theater with an Alpha King's escort, the deniability he'd been protecting for 6 years was already gone. He had nothing left to lose by committing everything. She had given him the reason to stop hesitating. Her plan had triggered exactly what it was supposed to prevent. There was a particular kind of devastation that comes not from being wrong about facts, but from being wrong about the person you thought you understood. From discovering that the pattern you've studied for years had changed, or had always had a dimension you hadn't reached, or had simply encountered a set of stakes that overrode every behavioral tendency you'd correctly identified. She had been right about Malgrath's psychology. She had been wrong about what 6 years of pursuit and the formal recognition of his victim's claim would do to it when they arrived at the same moment. She had miscalculated. People were going to die because of it. She was not going to let that calculus stand without doing something about it. "Stop the column," she said. Valor looked at her. "Stop it," she said again. "Hold position here, at the crest. Don't ride down into the flat. If we hold position, the pursuit closes from behind." "I know." She was already turning her horse, not backward, sideways to the edge of the road, where the rise of the crest gave her a sightline down to the flat below and to the riders arranged at its far end. "Let me try something." "Elyria, 30 seconds." She looked at him. "Give me 30 seconds." He held her gaze for the length of a single breath. He raised his fist. The column halted. She rode to the edge of the crest. She was very aware of what she was doing. She was a woman on a horse at the top of a visible rise, in a sapphire blue dress that every trained operative in Malgrath's network would recognize on sight, within range of anyone below with a decent bow and a willingness to use it. She was making herself visible in the most complete possible sense. Not the visibility of someone who has been seen, but the visibility of someone who has chosen to be seen, who is presenting themselves to be seen, who is using their own visibility as the argument. She straightened her spine. She looked down at the riders in the flat, and she waited. What she was waiting for was the one thing she had not miscalculated, the one element of Malgrath's psychology that she was still certain of, that 6 years of studying him had given her that she was not prepared to abandon even now, at a crest above a flat ground with 100 of his riders closing around her. Malgrath Voss wanted her alive. He had always wanted her alive. Not out of mercy. There was no mercy in that man, no sentiment about bloodlines or the dignity of fallen houses. He wanted her alive because a dead claimant was a martyr, and a rallying point, and a political problem that could not be solved. A living claimant was a resource. A living empress with a formal recognition from the Alpha King of the continent's most powerful wolf territory was, potentially, the most valuable bargaining chip in the continental political landscape. He would not order his archers to shoot. Not yet. Not while she was standing here in plain sight in her mother's color, visible to every rider on that flat ground, and every person behind her and every observer within 5 miles, who might later be called to testify about what had happened on this road this morning. The riders in the flat had stopped advancing. She had 10 seconds before the pursuit from behind closed the gap enough to make the column's position untenable. She used them. She put her horse forward down the slope toward the flat, at a walk. Not a charge. Not a retreat. A walk. The specific pace of a woman who is moving toward something by choice. Behind her she heard the sound that was either going to save everyone or end everything. Valor's horse. Moving with her. She did not look back. She knew his position by sound. Behind and to her right, slightly back, The position of someone who has made a decision to be where the person he's accompanying is, rather than where tactical logic recommends. She knew the sound of his horse by now. She had been listening to sounds and cataloging them for 6 years. They rode down into the flat together, the 100 riders held. Because 100 riders had just watched the Alpha King of the Draxan territory ride forward to meet them on open ground, on a road that he had a legal right to travel, with a formally recognized claimant beside him, who had every legitimate authority to be moving toward a throne that had been taken from her. And shooting them, openly, on a public road, in front of witnesses from both sides, was not a decision that even the most ruthless operative could make without specific and explicit authorization from the man who sent them. They needed to hear from Malgrath. Malgrath needed time to decide. That time was what she had bought. Not victory, not safety, just time. He emerged from the tree line on the east side of the flat road like a man who has been waiting for exactly this moment and has arranged every element of the staging with the specific theatrical instinct of someone who understands that power is, at its core, a performance that has to be believed. Malgrath Voss was not what most people expected when they encountered him for the first time. The stories had built something monstrous, a dark sorcerer of the classic stamp, towering and terrible, the physical embodiment of everything his name was used to frighten people with. The reality was a man of medium height in his early 60s, with gray at his temples and a face that had been, by any objective assessment, kind-looking before whatever internal project he'd committed himself to had set its specific signature on his features. The eyes were the thing, pale brown, extremely still, the eyes of a man who had spent decades learning to observe without reacting, to want without showing, to calculate in the space that most people used for feeling. He rode a black horse to the center of the flat ground and stopped. He looked at Elyria. She looked at him. 6 years. She had been 9 years old the first time she'd seen him, at her mother's court, a newly appointed advisor, brilliant and soft-spoken and radiating the specific quality of a man who would be very useful to have on your side. She had been 22 the last time she'd seen him, on the night he had sealed the doors of her mother's private chambers while the Empress's personal physician stood outside them with a face that had told her, without a single word, that the contents of the cup her mother had drunk an hour ago were not what they'd been presented as. She had spent 2 days hiding in the palace walls before the escape. 2 days listening to him manage the aftermath. 2 days understanding, with the cold completeness that comes from hearing something said by someone who doesn't know you can hear it, exactly what she was to him. Not a person, not even an enemy, but a loose end. He had spent 6 years trying to tie it off. He looked at her now across 40 feet of flat road, with the expression of a man who has just watched a situation move beyond the clean resolution he'd planned for and is deciding how to adapt. "Elyria," he said. Her name in his mouth was a completely different thing than it had been in Valor's. It was the sound of something being assessed for value. "Malgrath," she said, "you've made things considerably more complicated than they needed to be." He said it with the measured tone of a man reporting an observation, not lodging a complaint. "You had options, years of them, quieter ones. I used the options available to me. And now here we are." He looked past her at Valor, then back. "You understand what happens next." "I understand what you believe happens next," she said. "You have numerical advantage. You believe that gives you control of the outcome. You've been in numerical advantage for 6 years and you haven't been able to close it, which suggests that numerical advantage is not actually the limiting factor." A pause. Something moved in those pale, still eyes. Not anger. Anger was too hot a thing for this man. Something colder. The specific recalculation of someone who is not accustomed to being spoken to this directly and is deciding whether to find it amusing or dangerous. "You've grown up," he said. "I had a good education." "Your mother's? Yours." She held his gaze. 6 years of watching how you work taught me more about power than 20 years in a court would have. You operate through layers, through intermediaries and proxies and forged documents and deniable channels. You're very good at it. You've been doing it so long you've started to believe it's strength." She looked at him steadily. "It isn't. It's the operational style of a man who is afraid of direct conflict. Which is why you're sitting on your horse in the middle of this road instead of giving an order. Was Bumasam. The flat was very quiet. 100 riders. 21. The specific loaded silence of a space where violence was present as possibility and had not yet become reality. Malgrath looked at her for a long moment. "Bring her," he said. Not to her, to the riders around her. And the world moved. The encirclement closed from three sides simultaneously, the pursuit from behind completing the loop, the flat ground riders pressing in, the East Ridge element descending at a gallop. It happened fast, the way these things always happen fast when they'd been planned and positioned and the signal had been given, and fast was the thing that planning bought you. Not certainty, but the ability to compress the time available to the person being acted on to a point where reaction became almost impossible. Almost. Violor's hand signal was nothing more than 2 fingers extended and swept, a gesture she'd now seen twice, in the courtyard and on the road, and that she now understood was the Alpha Guard signal for split engagement. The formation fractured in precisely the way a formation fractures when the people in it have trained for exactly this scenario. Not panicking apart, but dividing with purpose, each element taking a specific zone of the encirclement and pressing into it rather than away from it. The principle being that an encirclement is only effective when the people inside it accept the geometry. When they don't, when they drive toward the circumference rather than clustering at the center, the geometry becomes briefly uncertain. Briefly was enough. She drove her horse forward into the gap between 2 of the encircling riders, and the mare, selected, she understood now, by someone who had anticipated exactly this, did not balk. The gap was narrow, and the riders were moving to close it, and she went through it at a pace that she had not ridden at in 6 years, faster than her body had remembered was possible, faster than the fear that was running concurrently with everything else had space to fully register. She was through the ring before it sealed. She turned. What she saw in the flat ground behind her was not a battle in the cinematic sense. It was not a thing of choreographed heroics or clean dramatic resolution. It was the specific, terrible reality of 21 people in a space with 100, each of them making split-second decisions about where to be and where not to be. Each decision carrying the full weight of a life that was the only one they had. The Alpha Guard were extraordinary. She could see it even through the chaos. The specific quality of people who had trained beyond the point of thinking, who were operating on something beneath conscious decision, the deep muscle memory of absolute preparation meeting an absolute demand. But 21 was 21. She saw Aldrich take a hit to his left shoulder and keep moving. She saw one of the flank riders go down. She saw Valor. He was in the center of the press, not holding back, not commanding from a safe position, but in the middle of it, the way the alpha king of a wolf territory moves, when the fight has reached the point where command from distance becomes an abstraction, and the only real thing is the ground directly in front of you. He was fighting with the economy of someone who had been doing this for 20 years, and had long since passed the point of any unnecessary motion. Every movement had a purpose, and the purpose was survival, his own and the people beside him. She was not supposed to go back in. She knew she was not supposed to go back in. She was the asset. She was the recognized claimant, the political weight, the thing this entire operation existed to protect and deliver. She was the reason 21 people were in a flat field against 100, and getting herself killed or captured in that flat field would make every single one of their positions worse, not better. She knew all of this. She pulled the mare's head around and drove back into the fight, not recklessly. She was not a soldier, and she had no illusions about what she was and wasn't capable of in this context. But she had ridden since childhood, and she had 6 years of understanding exactly how Malgrath's operational people worked, and what she knew, from 4 years of studied intelligence, was that every one of Malgrath's hunting units had a single operative within it whose removal compromised the unit's function. Not the most visible fighter, the one who held the targeting information, who maintained the unit's communication with the central command, who kept track of the objective in a fluid engagement and redirected the others when the situation changed. She could identify them by behavior. She knew what to look for. She found the first one in 30 seconds, a rider on the northwest edge of the engagement who was moving laterally rather than pressing, watching the whole field rather than focusing on individual opponents, using hand signals rather than shouted orders. She drove the mare directly at him, not as an attack but as a displacement. A horse moving toward you at pace required a response, and the response compromised the signals he was sending. And the compromise rippled outward through the unit he was managing in ways that were not dramatic but were real. She did it 3 times. It did not turn the battle. Nothing she could do was going to turn the battle at this ratio. What it did was slow the rate at which the geometry of the engagement was collapsing, and slow was not victory, but it was time, and time was the only currency she had to spend. She was on the 3rd pass when she heard it, from the north, from the direction they'd been riding toward, from beyond the flat ground and the tree line and the rise of the road. A sound she identified before she understood it, the way you identify sounds that you've heard before in very specific contexts, the massed movement of a large mounted force at pace. Not Malgrath's. The direction was wrong for Malgrath's. She pulled the mare to a stop and looked north. The first riders came over the rise in Draxan colors. Not the Alpha Guard's field gray, but the full military colors of the Draxan Northern Legion, the force that had been in preparation posture for 3 weeks and had, it appeared, been put into active movement at some point in the previous hours by an order she hadn't been privy to. Behind the first riders came more, and more. The count went past 30 before she stopped counting, because counting had stopped mattering. Aldrich. She understood it in one clear, clean moment. Aldrich had sent riders south from the point position when the encirclement geometry became clear, before the ambush had closed, in the brief window when the forward element had still had space to maneuver. He had sent them back to the fortress, or to whatever pre-positioned staging point Valor had established 3 weeks ago when the northern campaign plans had first been formalized. The reinforcement hadn't been improvised in response to this morning. It had been built into the plan Valor hadn't shared with her because the plan had too many moving parts to brief in the time they'd had. The relief force hit the engagement from the north. The mathematics changed. Malgrath's riders, encirclement broken and now caught between 2 forces, made the calculation that all fighters make when the odds shift past a threshold, not a conscious decision, but a physical one. The body understanding before the mind does that the engagement has become something different from what it started as. The coherence of the attack fractured. Units that had been pressing inward began pulling back, the instinct of survival overriding the structure of the operation. In the middle of the fracturing, she found Valor. He was on his horse, still, unhurt to every visible sign, but there was blood on his left arm that was not from a minor wound, and his expression had the specific controlled quality of a man who is managing pain through will alone and is fully aware that will is a finite resource. He saw her the moment she reached him, and something in his face did the thing she'd been doing everything possible not to observe happening in his face since the East Tower. "Reinforcements," she said. "Aldrich sent them 2 hours ago," he said. "I told him to if we left the fortress on the main road." "You planned for this." "I planned for a version of this." His voice was tight. The arm. The specific version turned out to be worse. Around them, the engagement was resolving. Not cleanly, not without cost, but resolving. Malgrath's forces were pulling back toward the east ridge, the coherence of their operation gone, the numerical advantage that had been deployed as a certainty becoming instead a retreat. The Draxan Northern Legion held the north end of the flat. The Alpha Guard held the center. The road behind was clear. Malgrath. She turned to find him. He was still at the position he'd taken when he emerged from the tree line, still on the black horse, still at the center of the flat, but no longer surrounded by the tight formation of his operational command. Those had moved, retreated, made the survival calculation. He was nearly alone, and he was looking at the field with the specific expression of a man watching something he built over 6 years come apart in 20 minutes. He looked at her. She rode toward him. She heard Valor's horse behind her. She heard him say her name, not a warning, or not only a warning, but the sound of a man watching someone he has decided matters to him move toward something that could still hurt her, and being unable to stop it because he understands, finally and fully, that you cannot stop a queen from going where she decides to go. You can only follow. His horse kept moving. She rode until she was 20 feet from Malgrath Voss. She stopped. He looked at her with the pale, still eyes that had looked at her across her mother's court when she was 9 years old, and she looked back at him with the full, undisguised, carefully assembled attention of a woman who had spent 6 years studying his every available movement and was now, for the first time, doing it to his face. "It's over," she said. He looked at the field, the retreat, the Northern Legion holding the road. This engagement, he said. This engagement. The 6 years before it. The empire you built on a foundation of someone else's name. She kept her voice level, not with the effortful control of suppression, but with the natural steadiness of someone who is saying something they have known for a long time and are now simply delivering. You're going to face a tribunal. Every servant you intimidated, every noble you corrupted, every person you used my name against, they're going to have the chance to say what happened, and whatever you thought you built is going to be held up in front of every court on this continent in full light. A pause. Surrender now, or I will spend every resource I have for however long it takes to ensure that what happens next is slower and worse. Malgrath looked at her. Something moved through his face. Not the calculation, not the performance, but something underneath both of those. The specific thing that shows in a person's face when they are confronted, at last, by the consequence of something they chose and cannot unchoose. He had spent 6 years thinking of her as a loose end, a problem to be managed, a liability that needed removal. He was looking at her now as a person. It was, she thought, too late for that particular evolution to help him. His hand moved, not toward her, toward his coat, toward something inside it, and the motion had the specific compressed urgency of a man who has decided that the alternative to what's happening is better managed by a single decisive action than by the tribunal she'd just described. Forbidden magic. The first of it came out of his hand as color. Not fire, not lightning, but a sickly greenish luminescence that carried with it the smell of something that had no business existing in the open air. A smell that hit the back of the throat and immediately began doing something to the respiratory system. She heard the horses around her react, not just hers, but all of them. Every animal on the field registering the wrongness of the thing he'd released before any human present had fully processed what it was. She drove the mare sideways, away from the direct line of it. She heard someone behind her, one of the Alpha Guard too close to the spread when it moved, make a sound that was not a battle cry. She heard Valor, not a sound of pain. Something else, something she had no word for, but that her wolf, freed of every restraint now, identified with absolute and devastating clarity. She turned. He was still mounted. He had taken the edge of it, the margin of the cloud, not the center. And he was still on his horse, and he was still holding his sword, and he was still, by every visual measure, fighting. But the arm that had already been bleeding had stopped moving correctly, and his horse was moving sideways under him in the specific, disorganized way of an animal whose rider's balance has shifted without the rider's intention. And his face had gone the color of stone. She drove the mare back toward him. The magic was still moving, spreading outward from Malgrath's position in a slow, terrible expansion that was doing something to the air that she could feel at the edges of her own breath, a tightening, a resistance. Around her, the Alpha Guard was faltering, not breaking, not fleeing, because these were not people who broke, but the specific involuntary degradation of physical capacity that happened when something was attacking the body's fundamental mechanisms rather than its structural integrity. She reached Valor. She put her hand on his arm. He looked at her. "I'm fine," he said. "You're not," she said. "I'm fine enough." His jaw was set. His gray eyes were clear. Whatever the magic was doing to his body, it had not reached his mind. "Can you get through it?" She looked at Malgrath 20 feet away, with the green light still moving from his hands and the expression on his face of a man who has played the last card he has and is watching to see if it's enough. She looked at the space between herself and him. She thought about 6 years of survival, about what survival required, about the woman in the mirror in the East Tower who had looked like herself for the first time in 6 years and had put on her mother's color and ridden out the gate because there was nothing left to lose that she wasn't already prepared to lose. She thought about what her mother had told her about the law of their bloodline. A queen does not kneel for survival. She looked at Malgrath Voss. She rode directly at him. The magic hit her like a wall, a pressure against the chest, a tightening of the throat, the body's immediate and violent rejection of something that was not supposed to exist in proximity to living tissue. She felt it. She did not stop. Because the thing about the specific form of survival that she had been practicing for 6 years was that it had built something in her that pure comfort never could have. A tolerance for the unbearable, a capacity to keep moving through conditions that should have stopped her. A bone-deep familiarity with the experience of pushing through the wall of what was possible because the alternative was worse. She drove the mare through the edge of the cloud. She drove through the center of it. She drove through the other side of it and came out with her lungs burning and her eyes streaming and the mare's sides heaving and Malgrath Voss's black horse directly in front of her with nowhere left to go and the man on it looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before in 30 years of shared terrible history. Fear. She reached forward. She took his reins. The green light died. Behind her, across the field, in the sudden absence of the magic, she could hear the Alpha Guard recovering. Breath returning, posture straightening, the specific sound of people who have had something taken from them getting it back. She could hear the Northern Legion's horses moving. She could hear the retreat of Malgrath's forces, faster now, the operational coherence of a 100-rider engagement gone completely. She held his reins. She looked at him. Malgrath Voss looked back at her. And from behind her, barely 20 feet away, she heard the sound of Valor's horse moving. Slow, deliberate. The pace of a man whose body was asking him to stop and who was declining the request. Moving forward until he was alongside her. Until the three of them occupied the same 20 feet of flat road in the northern corridor with the smell of magic and blood and frost in the air and the field going quiet around them. Valor looked at Malgrath. His voice, when he spoke, was the quietest it had been all morning. The quiet of absolute authority that has nothing left to perform. "Get off the horse," he said. Malgrath Voss got off the horse. He did it slowly, not from age or injury, but from the specific deliberateness of a man who is performing his last act of control by controlling the pace at which his surrender occurs. He stood in the dead winter grass of the flat road with his hands at his sides and the green light gone from them, and he looked at Elyria with the pale still eyes that had been calculating since before she was born, and for the first time in 30 years of shared terrible history, he had nothing left to calculate with. The Alpha Guard closed around him. He did not resist. Resistance at this point would have been a kind of theater that Malgrath Voss, who had spent 60 years understanding the difference between effective action and performed action, was not capable of. He had played his last card. It had not been enough. He was a man who understood consequences with great precision, and the consequence of this morning was standing 20 feet away in a sapphire blue dress with the reins of his horse still in her hand, looking at him with the expression of a woman who has waited 6 years for this exact moment and is experiencing it not with triumph, but with the specific, exhausted clarity of someone whose long work has finally concluded. She let go of his reins. She turned her horse. She rode back to Valor. He was still upright in the saddle, which was an achievement that she suspected was costing him more than his face was showing. The wound in his arm had bled through the field dressing someone had managed to apply during the engagement's final minutes, and his left hand was holding the reins with a grip that was functional but not comfortable, and his color was the specific gray pale of a person whose body has been running on will for longer than will was designed to sustain. She pulled her horse alongside his. She looked at him. "You sent the Legion before we left the fortress," she said. "Aldrich sent them, on my standing order from 3 weeks ago." His voice was tight at the edges, controlled. "The order was to move on the main road if we moved on the main road. He executed it. You planned for the possibility that we'd be in exactly the position we were in. I planned for the possibility that the plan would change." A pause. "Plans change. I've been doing this long enough to build the change into the original." She looked at him for a moment. At the gray eyes that had been looking at her since the corridor outside the war room, the face of the man who had said her name twice in one morning, and in doing so had broken 6 years of architecture. She thought about the specific quality of what he'd built here. Not just the military plan, not just the political strategy, but the willingness to be present in the middle of it rather than at the edge of it. The willingness to ride forward when riding forward was the most dangerous available choice. The willingness to follow when following required trusting someone he had known for 8 hours. Trust in her experience was built over years. He had built a functional version of it in one morning. She didn't know what to do with that yet. She turned her horse toward the north. "We need to keep moving," she said. "The passes won't hold indefinitely." Agreed. He moved his horse alongside hers. "But we're taking the slower pace. My arm needs a surgeon before it needs another engagement. The surgeon is back at the fortress. Then we ride back at a pace compatible with me not bleeding to death." She looked at him. Something moved in her face, involuntary, brief, The specific involuntary movement of a person who has just heard someone they are trying very hard not to have feelings about acknowledge his own mortality in a way that makes the feelings difficult to manage. "Don't bleed to death," she said. "I'll make every effort," he said. They turned south. The return to Draxon Fortress took 3 hours at the pace his arm required. 3 hours of flat road and rising terrain and the specific complicated silence of two people who have just survived something together and have not yet decided what to do with the version of themselves that survived it. The Alpha Guard rode in close formation around them. Malgrath rode in the middle of it, bound and silent, looking at the road in front of his horse with the expression of a man conducting an internal accounting that he has not yet finished. Elyria rode and thought. She thought about what came next. The tribunal, the formal process, the specific legal and political architecture of the next 6 months. She thought about the Velthari Palace, which she had not seen in 6 years, and which she would need to see again, and about what it would look like to walk back into those rooms as the person who owned them, rather than the person who had fled them. She thought about what governing actually required. Not the theory of it, not the aspiration of it, but the daily grinding specific work of it, the decisions that had no clean answer, the people who would need things she might not have, the inherited damage of 6 years under a corrupt administration that would take years to address properly. She thought about Vaelor. She had been thinking about Vaelor with increasing frequency and decreasing suppression since the moment in the East Tower study when he had said her name and something in her chest had cracked open. The bond was not a quiet thing anymore. It had not been a quiet thing since the corridor outside the war room, but she had been managing it with the iron discipline of 6 years of survival. And in the last 24 hours that discipline had been eroded by circumstances that she had not been able to manage from a safe distance. And what remained in the absence of the suppression was something she was not yet prepared to fully examine. She had told him one thing at a time. One thing at a time was still operating. But the inventory of things remaining was considerably shorter than it had been at dawn. Thus, the fortress received them the way fortresses receive their returning kings, with the specific collective exhale of a place that has been holding its breath and is now, cautiously, releasing it. The gates opened. The yard assembled. The household and the garrison and the various inhabitants of a working fortress who had known, in the way that people inside a military household always know, that something significant had left this morning and were now assessing, from the formation of its return, how significant the cost had been. Malgrath was taken immediately to the secure holding level, not the same wing as Seraphine and Harwick, but a separate and older section of the fortress that had been designed for exactly this category of prisoner. The Alpha Guard surgeon was in the main yard before Vaelor had fully dismounted, and the expression on the surgeon's face when he saw the arm suggested that the controlled quality of Vaelor's performance over the previous 3 hours had been more costly than he'd acknowledged. Elyria dismounted in the yard and watched the surgeon's assessment with the specific focused attention of someone cataloging information rather than allowing themselves to react to it. The wound was serious, not immediately life-threatening, but the kind of serious that required immediate intervention and enforced stillness afterward. And Vaelor's relationship with enforced stillness was, she suspected, complicated. She was right about that. "I have a tribunal to begin scheduling," he said to the surgeon, who was in the process of examining the arm with the expression of a man whose professional opinion was being preemptively challenged. "You have an arm that is going to develop an infection if it isn't properly cleaned and closed in the next hour," the surgeon said. "The tribunal will wait. The arm will not." Vaelor looked at Elyria. "He's right," she said. "You have no strong opinion about whether I prioritize the tribunal. I have a very strong opinion about whether you die of an infection in your own fortress 2 days after surviving a 100-rider ambush." She looked at him steadily. "Go with the surgeon." A pause. Something in his expression, the specific expression of a man who has spent 20 years operating as the final authority in every room he occupied and is experiencing, with some combination of disorientation and something he hasn't identified yet, the sensation of being told what to do by someone whose instruction he is inclined to follow. He went with the surgeon. The tribunal scheduling took 3 days, not because the legal framework was complicated. The framework had been building for 6 years and the documentation was extensive, but because the scope of what needed to be addressed required coordination with 5 other kingdoms, each of which needed to be formally notified of Malgrath's capture and the restoration of the Velthari claim, each of which had its own interests and processes, and representatives who needed to arrive and be housed and briefed. The fortress became, in those 3 days, the most densely politically occupied space on the continent, and Elyria was at the center of every conversation, and she did not sleep more than 4 hours in any single night. Veilor's surgeon enforced 24 hours of rest and lost the subsequent arguments. On the second day, Veilor appeared in the war room, where she was working through the 5th set of diplomatic correspondence with Aldrich and 2 of the newly arrived foreign representatives, and he sat down at the table and did not make any reference to the surgeon or the previous 24 hours, and Aldrich and the foreign representatives did not comment on it, and they worked until the second bell of evening. When the foreign representatives left, and Aldrich left, and the room was just the 2 of them, and the maps and the correspondence, and the specific tired quiet of 2 people who have been working in parallel intensity for 2 days, Veilor said, "The Harwick investigation is complete." And 3 years of documented payments, the treaty routing codes, the patrol schedules, the campaign preparation materials, enough for a full treason charge. A pause. He's cooperating with the investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. He gave us 2 additional names in the diplomatic corps that we hadn't identified. She filed this. Seraphine, different situation. His voice was careful. What she did was serious. The communication with Malgrath's network, the letter, but her actual cooperation with the network was limited and primarily driven by personal ambition rather than ideological alignment with Malgrath's project. He was looking at the table. I'm not interested in making her a martyr by treating 2 years of opportunism the same as 3 years of structured treason. Elyria considered this. What are you thinking? She said. Permanent removal from court. Full forfeiture of the Valicrest holdings that were involved in the Corvin investment. Supervised exile to the family's secondary estate for 3 years. He looked up. She's not a good person, but she's not Harwick either. And I'm not interested in the kind of justice that can't distinguish between degrees. She looked at him. He had spent the previous 2 days, in the hours when she hadn't been in the room with him, making decisions about the people who had betrayed him. About Harwick, who had been systematically undermining his counsel for 3 years. About Seraphine, who had sent a letter that had set hunters on the road. About the members of the diplomatic corps whose names Harwick had provided. He had made those decisions with the specific quality of care that she had been watching him apply to every difficult thing since the study at dawn 3 days ago. Not harshly, not softly, but precisely. The way a surgeon works. The way someone works who understands that the decisions made in the aftermath of a betrayal define the character of the person making them more definitively than the decisions made in the crisis itself. It is easy to be resolute in a storm. Every commander knows how to make decisions when the situation is active and the adrenaline is present, and the necessity of action overrides all competing considerations. The test of character is in the quiet after, in the moment when the emergency has passed and the decisions are no longer urgent and could be made differently, could be made with more heat or less compassion, and the person making them chooses deliberately anyway. The Corvin forfeiture is the right call, she said. The exile I'll defer to your judgment. It's your judgment, too. He said it without making a point of it. You have standing in this court now. Everything that happens in this investigation has political consequences for the Velthari restoration. I'm not making these calls unilaterally. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not used to that, she said. I know. He looked at her. Get used to it. The tribunal began on the 4th day. Malgrath Voss was brought into the main hall, the same hall where the spring sovereign ball had been held 6 days ago, now stripped of its banners and candles and rearranged into the formal configuration of a continental judicial proceeding. 5 kingdoms represented by their senior legal authorities. The Draxon Council, -2. Aldrich. The foreign representatives. The assembled household of the fortress, filling the gallery above, because the people who had spent 5 years working in the same rooms as a ghost had a right to see what the ghost had been working toward. And Elyria, seated at the primary claimant's table, in the same sapphire blue that she had worn on the road. She had considered other options. She had, in the end, chosen consistency. Let the color mean what it meant. Malgrath was seated opposite her across the hall. He looked, in the 4 days since the road, like a man who had been conducting his internal accounting and had arrived at numbers he didn't have a mechanism for managing. Not broken. He was not a man who broke in the conventional sense, who wept or raged or collapsed under the weight of consequence. He was a man who had spent a lifetime building structures and was now sitting in the wreckage of the largest one he'd ever built, and was, with the specific terrible patience that had always been his most dangerous quality, assessing it. The proceedings lasted 3 days. Survivors came forward, servants who had been in the Velthari palace on the night Elyria's mother died, noble families whose correspondence had been forged or suppressed, northern border communities who had spent 6 years under the economic stranglehold of Malgrath's proxy trade agreements, 3 members of his own former council who had maintained private records of orders they had been given and had spent 6 years waiting for a moment when those records could be presented to someone with the authority and the willingness to use them. Elyria sat through all of it. She listened. This was, she had understood from the beginning, the part that she owed people. Not the throne, not the political restoration, not any of the structural things that the next months and years would require. This specific act of sitting in a room and listening to what had been done under her name, to her people, in the 6 years of her absence. The listening was the beginning of the accounting. The accounting was the beginning of the repair. Repair did not mean restoration. She had understood this for years, but she understood it differently now, more completely, with the specific weight of someone who has seen what real damage looks like and knows that putting it back exactly as it was would be both impossible and wrong. The Velthari Empire that existed before Malgrath was not a perfect thing. No empire was. The work ahead was not to recreate it, but to build something better from what remained, with the knowledge she had now that she had not had at 22. That knowledge had a price. 6 years of it. She would not call it worth it. She would never call it worth it. The cost was too human, too specific, too much located in the bodies and lives of people who had not chosen to bear it. But she could call it real. She could take what those 6 years had taught her and refuse to waste the lesson. On the final day of the tribunal, Malgrath was given the opportunity to speak. He took it. He spoke for 11 minutes. Not in defense. He was not attempting to refute the documentation or the testimony, which was too comprehensive for refutation. He spoke, instead, with the specific quality of a man delivering an analysis of his own failure, not an apology. Something more honest than an apology, and considerably more unsettling, an assessment. He had made certain calculations. The calculations had been correct within their own framework. The framework had been wrong. The framework had been wrong because it had treated other people's lives as variables rather than as things with inherent and non-negotiable weight, and the error in that treatment had been, finally, structural, had produced a structure that could not sustain itself because it was built on material that was not designed to bear that kind of load. He did not say he was sorry. He said he understood now what he had not understood before. Elyria listened to every word. She looked at him across the hall when he finished. She did not forgive him. Forgiveness was not the transaction available in this room. Forgiveness was something that lived between a person and their own interior architecture, a thing you did not for the person who had wronged you, but for the weight you were carrying, and she was not ready to put that weight down yet, and she would not perform readiness she didn't have. What she did was look at him with the full, complete, undisguised attention of a woman who had spent 6 years surviving the consequences of his decisions and was now, for the last time, seeing him clearly. She looked at him until he looked back, and then she looked away. The sentence was eternal imprisonment in the northern detention facility that existed for exactly this category of political criminal, removed from power, removed from access, present in the world but no longer able to move within it in any meaningful way. Not execution. She had argued against execution, and the argument had not been about mercy or sentiment, it had been about instruction. A dead man becomes a story that can be edited. A living man who has been publicly stripped of everything he built remains what he actually is, the specific, unromanticizable reality of what happens when ambition operates in the complete absence of conscience. Let him be the lesson. Let him live as the lesson. The hall cleared slowly after the sentencing. The legal authorities gathered their documents. The foreign representatives prepared their departing communications. The gallery above emptied in the particular gradual way that rooms empty when they've held something significant, and people are reluctant to fully leave it. Elyria sat at the claimant's table after everyone else had gone, just for a moment, just to be in the silence of it.
Does she?
Veilor found her there. He came in through the side entrance that connected the hall to the corridor leading toward his private study, and he moved with less compression than he'd moved with for the previous 6 days. The surgeon had apparently won some of the later arguments, and the arm was healing, and the specific controlled urgency of a man operating through managed pain had relaxed into something more like his natural pace. He came to the table and sat in the chair beside her rather than across from her, and they were quiet together in the empty hall for a while. The candles from the tribunal had burned low. The afternoon light was coming through the hall's high windows at the specific amber angle of late winter, moving toward spring. Not warm yet, but carrying the promise of warmth the way some things carry promises before they're ready to deliver them. "It's done," he said. "This part," she said. "This part," he agreed. The next part was the north. The return to the Velthari Palace. The specific grinding necessary work of putting a governance structure back in place where one had been deliberately demolished. Months of it. Years in the fullest accounting. She was not afraid of it. She had been building toward it for 6 years, and she knew the material, knew the people who would need to be found and re-engaged and trusted with pieces of the reconstruction, knew the specific areas of damage that were most urgent and the ones that could be addressed in sequence. She knew how to do this. She was going to do it. "I'll need to leave within the week," she said. "The longer the palace sits without a legitimate administration, the more the instability compounds." "I know." "The formal union negotiation, the terms you proposed, that's a conversation for after the initial stabilization. It can't be rushed for political optics on either side." "Agreed." She looked at him. He was looking at the amber light coming through the windows, and his profile had the quality of a man who is thinking about something he is deciding how to say, which was, she had learned in 6 days of working beside him, a relatively rare state. He generally said things when he had them. The hesitation was information. "Say it," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not a man who does things by halves," he said. "I want you to know that before you go north, because once you're in the middle of a reconstruction, I don't want there to be a thing unsaid that should have been said when we were sitting in the same room." He held her gaze with the directness that was simply how he occupied every space he was in. "The bond. What I said in the stairwell 3 days ago. I meant it then, and I mean it more now. And I'm not interested in managing it as a diplomatic variable or as a political consideration or as any kind of secondary concern. It is not a secondary concern. It is a primary one. You can tell me what you need it to be right now. I'll work with whatever that is. But I needed you to know what it is for me." Elyria looked at him. She thought about 6 years of suppression, about the specific exhausting discipline of keeping the thing pressed down and managed and contained. The daily practice of denying what she felt in the marrow of herself. The cost of that denial compounded across 5 years of cold floors and gray dresses and the weight of carrying her real name in silence. She thought about the mirror in the East Tower, the woman who had finally looked like herself. She thought about what her mother had told her, not the law of their bloodline, not the instruction about queens and survival and standing up. The other thing, the thing her mother had said on a winter evening when Elyria was 17 and asking questions about the nature of the bond between paired wolves and her mother, had looked at her across the firelight with an expression that she hadn't fully understood until now. She had said, "The bond is not a weakness. It is the one thing powerful enough to survive everything else." "I know what it is for me," she said. "I've known for approximately 4 years and 11 months. Veilor was very still. "I'm going north in a week," she said. "There's work to do there that I have to do myself, that no one else can do for me, and that I won't ask you to put your governance aside to do with me. That's real, and it's not negotiable." She held his gaze. "But the work is not the whole life, and I'm done letting survival be the only category I operate in." A long moment. "What are you saying?" he said. Not a demand. The question of a man who has learned to be careful about the gap between what he wants to hear and what is actually being said. "I'm saying I'll come back," she said. "I'm saying I'm not disappearing again. I'm saying the negotiation you proposed, the formal one, about the union, about what 2 kingdoms becoming one actually looks like, I'm prepared to have it. All of it. The hard parts and the compromised parts and the parts where our interests don't align, and we have to work it out without either of us capitulating to the other. A pause. I'm not interested in a convenient arrangement. I'm not interested in what looks like partnership from the outside. I'm interested in the real thing, which is considerably more complicated, and I suspect you know that. I know that, he said. Then we agree on the terms. Something happened in his expression. Not a smile exactly, because the situation was not a simple one, and neither of them was the kind of person who responded to complex things simply. But the specific easing of something that had been held carefully in place for 6 days, or possibly much longer, that was now allowed to be what it was. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. She did not move her hand away. They sat in the amber light of the empty hall, and outside the high windows the sky was doing what late winter skies did in this part of the continent, turning from the pale, non-committal white of the cold months to something that was almost tentatively beginning to carry color. Not yet, but almost. 2. She rode north 8 days later. Aldrich provided the escort, 30 of the Northern Legion, formally assigned and formally documented, which was itself a political statement that every kingdom on the continent would read correctly. She rode at the head of the column in the sapphire blue, and she carried in her saddlebag the oilcloth package of 4 years of collected intelligence, not because she still needed it as a survival resource, but because it was the record of what she had done in the years when doing was the only available alternative to not surviving, and she was not ready to put it in an archive yet. She was 3 hours from the fortress when she allowed herself to feel it, the full weight of what was behind her and ahead of her simultaneously, the specific gravitational complexity of a person standing at the exact intersection of everything they survived and everything they had yet to build. The past 6 years were not gone. They were not wounds that had been healed or debts that had been settled. They were material, the raw, expensive, irreplaceable material of a woman who had been taught by extremity what no comfortable life could have taught her. She had learned in the gray dress and the cracked hands and the cold floors what kingdoms were actually built from. Not crowns, not councils, not the formal ceremonies of recognized authority, people. The specific weight and need and dignity of ordinary people who carried the daily reality of governance on their backs, without ever being visible in the records that described that governance. She had been one of them for 5 years. She knew them not as an abstraction or a principle, but as the specific, breathing, complicated humans who shared the dormitory and the kitchen and the corridor. Madame Corvith with her left ear and her iron management of 30 women's daily logistics. The seamstress who had worked in focused silence for 2 hours to make a queen's dress from 3 yards of diplomatic silk. The guard at the gate who watched the rider leave and thought nothing of it because no one had told him yet. She was going to build something for them. Not for their gratitude. She was not interested in gratitude as a political resource, for the actual fact of them, for the reality that a kingdom was not a structure imposed on people from above, but a structure that only held if the people at every level of it understood that it was holding something worth sustaining. She would make mistakes. She had no illusions about that. Governance at scale, in a damaged context, after 6 years of deliberate destruction by someone who had known exactly how to dismantle what held an empire together, that was not a project that went cleanly. There would be decisions she'd make wrong and need to unmake. There would be people she trusted who didn't deserve it, and people she underestimated who did. There would be days when the weight of the crown, which was a burden, which had always been a burden, which her mother had tried to tell her about in terms she hadn't been ready to fully receive, was heavier than she'd calculated. She was going to do it anyway, because the alternative to imperfect, effortful, accountable governance was what she had spent 6 years living in the shadow of, and she had seen with complete and irreversible clarity what that shadow cost. The pass opened onto the northern corridor in mid-afternoon, and the landscape changed the way landscapes change when you cross an elevation into a new region. The light shifted, the air shifted, the smell of the ground shifted. She had crossed this way 6 years ago in the opposite direction, on a stolen horse with her name buried under the first layer of a lie she was building as fast as she could. She had been 22 years old, and every decision she made for the next 6 years had been made from the specific compressed urgency of a person who has just lost everything and is running on the animal certainty that running is better than standing still. She was 28 now. She was not running. She was moving at the pace of a column with a clear destination and a full escort, and the specific, unhurried quality of someone who has decided, at a fundamental level, that she is done letting fear set the pace of her life. Behind her, 300 miles south, in an obsidian fortress that she now knew the particular smell of in every season, that she knew by the sound of its floorboards and the temperature of its corridors and the quality of its silences, a man was doing what he did every morning, which was making decisions about the governance of an enormous and complicated territory, with the specific, unsparing attention of someone who understood that leadership was not a privilege, but a weight. He was also, she knew, tracking the timeline of the Northern Restoration with the particular focused interest of a person who had a stake in its progress that was not purely political. She had told him she would come back. She had meant it. She was not, for the first time in 6 years, saying something she wasn't ready to mean. The column rode deeper into the northern corridor, and the mountains rose on both sides, and the sky overhead was the specific, deep blue of high altitude on a clear winter afternoon. Not the sapphire of her dress, not the blue of deep water, but something cleaner and colder and more honest than either of those. The blue of sky that has no ceiling. The blue of the kind of space that exists when you have finally, after a very long time, stopped hiding in smaller ones. Elyria Velthari rode toward the palace that had been taken from her. She was not afraid. She was not without fear. She had stopped pretending that the absence of fear was a virtue, or that leaders who claimed not to feel it were telling a useful truth. She felt it. She carried it alongside the grief and the anger and the specific tender uncertainty of someone who has survived so long in isolation that genuine connection, the kind she had ridden away from 8 days ago, the kind she was riding toward again in a different form, was still something she was learning how to hold without tensing around it. She carried all of it, and she rode forward anyway, because that was what the 6 years had finally, at the cost of everything they cost, taught her. Not that survivors are stronger than people who haven't survived, not that suffering produces wisdom automatically, or that endurance is its own justification, but something simpler and harder and more honest than any of those things. That the choice to keep moving, not away from the difficulty, but through it, toward the thing on the other side that was worth reaching, was not made once. It was made every day. It was made in the gray dress and the cracked hands. It was made in the moment of saying a real name out loud. It was made in the moment of riding through the edge of forbidden magic toward the man who had sent it. It was made now, on a northern road, on a gray mare, with 30 riders at her back and a clear sky overhead, and 6 years of everything she had survived compressed into the weight she carried in her spine. She was a woman who had been a ghost. She was a queen who had come back. The palace was waiting, and behind her, the world she was returning from had already started becoming something different from what it had been. Not because the story was over, but because the people inside it had finally, after years of operating in the wrong configuration, found the shape they were supposed to hold. That was enough. For now, that was more than enough.